You arrive at the fire circle. Hey guys, tonight we sit under the wide West African sky, the kind of night that seems to hum with the weight of 1,000 forgotten names. You walk across the dry ground, dust soft under your feet, toward a flickering circle of firelight at the center of the village. Around the fire sit elders, wrapped in robes that whisper with age, while children fidget beside wooden drums too large for their laps. The air smells like roasted millet and damp earth, and the only sound is the sharp snap of the fire as it settles into its evening rhythm. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're listening somewhere far away, post your location and local time in the comments. I love knowing where this little firelight spreads. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You step closer and sit cross-legged on a woven mat, your knees brushing the edge of a calabash bowl filled with dried fruit. The fire spits a slow, musical rhythm, and then, from the shadows, he begins. No scroll, no paper, no written cue, just breath and voice and memory. The Griot known here as a jelly clears his throat gently, a practiced ritual, and begins to speak. His voice is low, textured, but powerful, curling through the night air like smoke. He starts with a name, not his own, but a king's, then another name, then the name of that king's father, and that father's father, stretching back through time like footsteps in the sand. You don't interrupt. You wouldn't dare. You wouldn't survive this job anyway. You forgot your password twice this week, but this man, this Griot, is pulling up the memory of an entire kingdom from thin air. And you haven't even had dinner. You blink. He's still going. The names pile up like smooth stones. They form the spine of an empire, each syllable anchoring a story, a war, a treaty, a wedding that changed the course of trade. This isn't storytelling, this is structured memory. In the ancient empires of West Africa like Ghana, Mali, and Songhai, Griots weren't just entertainers, they were the living archives. A mainstream fact: Griots were official custodians of oral tradition in royal courts, acting as historians, praising as genealogists and diplomats. Their role was critical in kingdoms where literacy was rare and the written word was often reserved for trade, law, or religion. Without Griots, history would fade with the bodies of those who lived it. But there's more. You lean in, and so does he, though his posture barely shifts. He starts to describe a famous journey, a caravan of salt merchants crossing the Sahel. He doesn't just list what they carried. He mimics the rhythm of the camel hooves, the hiss of the sandstorms, the way the sun bounced off their brass bowls. You feel it. You're not listening anymore. You're there. He names every stop, every tribal boundary crossed. Every moment where memory becomes more than recollection, it becomes immersion. Here's your quirky fact for the night. Some Griots were known to recite genealogies that took hours, uninterrupted. One famous Griot was said to be able to recite the full lineage of the Qaeda dynasty from Sundiata's time to the current ruler without pause. This wasn't just talent, it was training. From childhood, Griots were taught through repetition, music, breath control, and community performance. It wasn't enough to remember, you had to embody the memory. But not everyone agrees on what exactly these Griots remembered. Here comes your scholarly debate. Were Griots keepers of true history, or artists of social memory? Some scholars argue that Griot narratives were shaped to suit the political needs of their patrons. If a ruler needed to boost his legitimacy, the Griots might lean into a particular lineage or quietly skip over a scandal. Others argue that while Griots performed for kings, they also served the people. They preserved counter-narratives, satire, jokes, and warnings hidden inside praise songs. The truth, like most things in history, probably lives somewhere in the middle. You glance around the fire. The younger children have gone quiet. An old woman nearby nods slowly in time with the Griot's voice. You can feel that this isn't just nostalgia's power. This man controls the room with nothing but syllables. In your world, people chase attention with thumbnails and clickbait. Here, all it takes is memory. The Griot shifts. He's telling of a prince who insulted a neighboring chief, and the resulting feud that nearly toppled a dynasty. You're expecting drama, but instead you get a clever parable about yam farming. You're confused, until you realize the story is doing double duty. It's a coded warning. Griots didn't just speak history, they interpreted it. Their words were like songs layered with secret meanings, understood only by those trained to listen beneath the surface. Another strange thing. You've noticed he never says I. Every story begins with, they say, or it is remembered, that he is not the author of these stories. He is the conduit. That's part of the humility of the Griot's craft. He becomes invisible so memory can be seen. A fire crackles louder, a drum hums softly in the background, a pulse too, steady the rhythm of thought. The Griot speaks of when the rains failed and the kingdom almost crumbled. He doesn't describe weather charts or crop reports. He tells you about the king who stopped speaking for a week, the merchant who sold his last grain, the old woman who sang to the clouds. In Griot history, human emotion is data, and memory isn't just about what happened, it's about what it meant. You shift on your mat. The earth is still warm from the day. You try to remember the last time you memorized something without writing it down. A poem in school, your Wi-Fi password. Nothing compares to this. Here, memory is a performance, a political act, a sacred duty. It isn't backup, it's foundation. The Griot's tone softens. He's ending the section of the story, but not the story itself. You realize there are no true endings here, just transitions. He will pause to sip from his calabash. He may adjust his robe, he may close his eyes, but the next breath will carry the next name, and that name will hold the next chapter, and on, until sunrise, or until memory rests. You sit back. The sky above you is wide and watchful. The stars blink as if nodding to what they've heard 1,000 times before. You wonder how many other fires like this one burn across West Africa tonight, and how many memories are being kept alive not by books or bites but by breath. You arrive at the fire circle, the village where memory never sleeps. You wake with a start, not because of a loud noise, but because the quiet has changed. The Griot's voice is still echoing, low and steady, like a drumbeat made of syllables. You hadn't realized you were dozing, but you must have drifted somewhere in the middle of a genealogy that stretched back through 7 dynasties and 3 camel trade routes. Around you, the fire has burned lower, now no more than glowing, red coals in a ring of ash, like the dying eye of a creature that only comes out to hear stories. You rub your eyes, and the soft warmth of the night presses in around you like a heavy wool blanket. The air smells different now, more like earth and damp wood than the dry sharpness of earlier. Somewhere, a flute whines softly, likely the work of a bored child or a sleepy musician keeping tempo with the rhythm of memory. The Griot, though, is still going. His robe has gathered dust on the hem, and his voice seems to draw energy not from his lungs but from the ground itself. You feel like you're watching an oracle who doesn't read bones or tea leaves. He reads time. Tonight, the Griot is taking you deeper, not just into the stories of kings and traders, but into the world of the Griots themselves. You learn that not all Griots were equal. A mainstream historical fact here. In Mali's royal court, there were official state-sponsored Griots tied to noble families. Each royal bloodline had its own assigned Griot, and some Griot lineages were just as old and prestigious as the families they served. One Griot family might have followed the descendants of Sundiata Keita for generations. Not as servants, but as memory bearers and witnesses. Their role was part historian, part PR manager, part spiritual advisor. But here's the quirky twist. Some Griots weren't fond of writing things down even after literacy became more common. Why? Well, they believed that writing made memory lazy, and that oral tradition carried something that ink on a page never could. Life. You squint at that idea, maybe feeling a little defensive about your own Google Docs and to-do lists. But then the Griot begins to recite a poem, long, winding, full of words you don't understand but whose rhythm you can feel in your chest, and you start to get it. This isn't information. This is experience. And yet, not everyone was a thank you or scholarly debate. Some colonial-era historians dismissed griots as unreliable entertainers or story spinners, arguing that oral histories lacked objectivity. These critics preferred written records from Arabic or European sources. But modern scholars, and particularly African historians, argue that griots had their own internal systems of fact-checking, repetition, and performance accountability. If a griot said the wrong name or date, elders or rival griots would correct him on the spot. It was like live peer review, with the added threat of public humiliation. You glance at the griot again, wondering if he's ever been corrected mid-performance. Probably not. His voice doesn't waver. His memory is ironclad. A young boy steps forward now, his feet kicking up tiny puffs of dust. The boy kneels beside the griot and begins to echo a portion of the story, line by line, mimicking the cadence. You realize you're witnessing a training session. Griots didn't just spring fully formed from the soil. They were made through years of listening, memorizing, repeating, and living the very histories they recited. Becoming a griot was more than learning stories. It was learning breath control, storytelling rhythm, appropriate gestures, and timing. Yes, timing. A well-timed pause could electrify an entire crowd. A poorly timed one, just awkward silence. You smirk, imagining a young Griot in training forgetting the name of a prince mid. The village elders probably sighed so loud the goats flinched. But here's something else. Griots weren't just historians, they were performers. And performances weren't always solemn. Griots were known to include humor, teasing, and sly jokes in their tales. It wasn't unusual for them to mimic voices, make exaggerated faces, or drop in a little shade about a current political leader via an ancient parable. You see that style now as the Griot describes a greedy merchant who kept a second storehouse hidden from the king. The crowd chuckles knowingly, and you get the feeling that maybe there's a greedy merchant in the current village. This blending of old and new is part of the Griot's genius. They weren't trapped in the past, they wove it into the present. The Griot now tells of a journey to Timbuktu, not the imaginary version from children's cartoons, but the real intellectual hub that once rivaled any European city in scholarship. He speaks of the great libraries there, the scholars who debated theology and astronomy beneath arching clay walls. But even then Griots were cautious. They visited the libraries, yes, but they didn't always write down their lore. Some Griots believed that memory needed motion, that words died in silence, so they kept speaking, always speaking. You listen, as the Griot transitions again, this time describing a wedding. Not a grand royal wedding with trumpets and gold. This one's simpler, earthy. He describes the food, the music, the way the bride wore her hair, the way her grandmother wept during the final dance. You realize he's keeping memories alive that would have otherwise evaporated. Not just battles and kings, but food, fashion, emotion. In the Griot's world, no detail is too small. Everything belongs. You feel the tension in your shoulders start to ease. The air is still warm, but a breeze has picked up, tugging at your sleeves again. The night insects are singing now, their high whines weaving in and out of the Griots, words like backup vocals. You close your eyes for a moment, not to sleep, but to better hear. And you wonder, in a world that's forgotten so much, how many stories are still whispered by those who remember. The Griot, still speaking, shifts to a darker moment, now in exile, a betrayal, a kingdom that turned on its own leader. But even here, his tone isn't angry, it's reflective, careful. You get the sense that Griots weren't about judgment. They were about recording, recounting, reminding. Even mistakes were sacred. Even shame had its place in the memory. The boy beside the Griot repeats a line, then another. His voice is shaky but sure. One day he'll be the one beside the fire. And maybe someone else, someone like you will, sit at the edge of the circle, listening, remembering, drifting into sleep as memory walks barefoot through the village once more. Training the memory keepers see are still sitting there, legs a bit numb now, but there's no part of you willing to shift too much and disturb the atmosphere. The fire has calmed embers, glowing softly like the slow breath of the earth, and the young boy's voice is fading as the older Griote resumes his place in the flow. You catch a look between the two of them, not exactly a nod, but something like a baton passed mid-stride, and it hits you. This is a marathon of memory, and Griots, they train for it like athletes. But instead of gyms and protein shakes, they build their minds with rhythm, repetition, and rice porridge at dawn. You glance at the boy again, now sitting beside a woman in a bright indigo wrapper who pats his shoulder as he leans into her. She's probably his mother or maybe his first teacher. Because Griots weren't trained by strangers. The art of memory, in this part of the world, was often passed down within families. That's your mainstream fact. Griot lineages are hereditary. And some Griot families in West Africa can trace their profession back over 700 years. You don't choose to be a Griot who are born into it, like being part of a guild where your first lullaby is a lesson in cadence, and your first birthday present might just be a talking drum. The training begins young. You're told stories not to entertain you, but to imprint them. And you repeat them over and over until the names, places, and metaphors are as familiar as your own reflection. You're expected to memorize long lists of ancestors, dynasties, trade routes, and proverbs, not just by rote but with nuance. You must know when to perform them loudly and when to whisper them like secrets. That's the art. But the fringe fact tonight is more surprising. Some Griots were expected to learn opposing versions of the same story and recite either one depending on the occasion. Imagine being told to memorize both the official record and the unofficial. Gossip and being able to recall them both with a straight face. It's like history and counter-history, both performed with equal elegance, and you can barely remember both sides of a coin toss. The Griot now leans into a tale about a noble who tried to fake his lineage to gain political favor. He says it with a straight face, but a corner of his mouth twitches, and the audience catches it. Laughter bubbles up, and you realize Griots didn't just record history, they policed it. If someone claimed to be the grandson of a hero but wasn't, the Griot could expose the lie in front of the entire village. Think of them as a one-person fact-checking service, wrapped in patent cloth and carrying centuries in their lungs. But scholars still debate this part. How much did Griots edit what they passed down? One camp says they were fiercely accurate walking libraries who preserved lineages with monk-like discipline. The other camp suggests they were creative collaborators, shaping stories to suit the politics of the time or to keep audiences engaged. After all, if a story gets too boring, no one remembers it, and if no one remembers it, it might as well have never happened. So Griots adapted. They adjusted metaphors, inserted current references, and even added musical elements to keep things vivid. What you're witnessing now, as the Griot begins to tap gently on a hollowed gourd drum while speaking, is a kind of memory theater. The percussion isn't just for effect, it reinforces the pace, helps with breath control, and underscores dramatic moments. It's like watching a spoken word poet who trained in a palace. You start to understand that Griot performance isn't passive, it's athletic. Each name, each metaphor, each proverb is like a weight lifted with grace and precision. They don't speak quickly, but they do speak densely. A single line might contain 3 references, 2 historical cues, and 1 moral lesson. You start to wonder how their minds are organized. Is it like a long hallway with labeled shelves, a mental map with winding trade roads? Or is it more like a melody where the rhythm itself carries the memory forward, like a canoe drifting downstream? You won't find out tonight. That's their secret. But what you do see, as the Griot shifts into a quieter tone, is how this performance doubles as training not just for the boy you saw earlier, but for everyone present. Elders nod in recognition. Mothers mouth words alongside the Griot. Children lean closer even as they yawn. This isn't passive listening. This is cultural rehearsal. You remember reading once that memory lives longer when it's shared out loud, and here you see it proven. The Griot now shifts to a battle story, not an epic one with clanging swords, but a psychological battle. A chief attempting to hold his people together after a harvest failure. He recites the chief's speeches, the whispered rumors of rebellion, and how the Griot of that time stepped in to calm the public with a story of a longer famine overcome by patience and community. That story, the Griot claims, saved the kingdom. Maybe it did, maybe it didn't. But tonight, it still matters, because it teaches something more than facts. It teaches faith. You're struck by the realization that Griots didn't just remember, they re-remembered. They took events and passed them through the filter of time, heart, and culture until they emerged not just preserved but deepened. It's like water, through rock carving wisdom from stone. The Griot pauses now, not dramatically, but naturally. He sips from a clay cup. The coals crackle a bit louder into silence. You hear a baby cry, then calm. You hear your own heartbeat, steady and slow. You think, this is what bedtime should be. Not flashing screens or autoplay noise, but the comfort of a voice that's been telling stories longer than your country has existed. You stretch your legs slightly and settle back down. The Griot's voice rises again, this time to describe the festival of the harvest moon. The description is rich. Fire dances, rattles, bowls of peanut stew, the ceremonial arrival of an elder who speaks in riddles, and as always, the Griot in the middle, remembering it all. Teaching the young, entertaining the old, binding the past to the present in real time. And you, lucky outsider, get to witness it. You close your eyes not to sleep, not yet, but just to let the words settle, like dust after a parade. You imagine your own memory, brittle and electronic, scattered across notes apps and cloud storage, and then you compare it to the Griot's organic, living, storied. There's a kind of reverence in that comparison. You think maybe, just maybe, there's still time to become a better listener. Strings, skins, and the pulse of memory. Your next breath draws in the scent of warming dawn, faint smoke, and something sweet, perhaps baobab, fruit roasting in a nearby hearth, and as you exhale you feel the village shifting from the hush of night into that drowsy half-light when roosters are still clearing their throats and children pretend they are not awake. Yet the Griot, who seems impervious to mere sunrise, is gently unwrapping a long tapered bundle at his feet, revealing an elegant 21-stringed kora whose calabash body gleams like polished amber in the ember glow. And you suddenly understand that stories here are never told alone. Music is their twin, heartbeat and mnemonic anchor. He plucks a single note, soft and round, and the air itself appears to lean closer. For these strings are more than accompaniment. They are cue cards carved from sound, each note prompting the next image, the next name, the next century. so that memory flows in rhythm the way blood follows arteries. You shift your weight, recalling last night's recitations, the endless genealogies, the whispered satire about greedy merchants, the boy's earnest echoing, and realize you have been drafted into this oral orchestra, not as a performer but as a living audience, a witness whose very listening helps cement the tale in collective mind. The Griot begins a new narrative, fingers dancing over nylon strings with a precision that makes you envy muscle memory far older than your own bones. And he paints the founding of Ouagadougou, the ancient Ghana Empire, describing how traders first followed desert stars to a market so rich even the dust sparkled with loose gold dust. A mainstream historical fact modern textbooks confirm, that medieval West Africa controlled a lion's share of the world's gold, feeding trans-Saharan routes that linked African savannas to Mediterranean ports. But then he slips into a quieter, conspiratorial tone to share a fringe detail seldom found in academic tomes, that some griots insist the first king of Ghana, Dingasist, was born with a tiny gold fleck in each eye which shimmered whenever he spoke truth, and dulled whenever he lied. An inherited tale his descendants tried to mask by coal-lining their eyelids. Scholars debate the veracity of such embellishments, arguing whether they served as moral allegories or coded political commentary. Yet the griot makes no apology for mixing miracle with record, because, in this tradition, truth is not merely data but guided memory shaped to move hearts as well as minds. The scholarly dispute you sense crackling beneath his melody concerns exactly that. Tension. Did griots intentionally mythologize leaders to reinforce authority? Or were these luminous anecdotes safeguards ensuring listeners stayed awake long enough to absorb critical information buried inside the wonder? Some modern historians argue the gilded flourishes were narrative sugar, while West African scholars countered that symbolism encoded ethical expectations. If a king's eyes lost their shine, people would recall the tale and judge him unfit. Thus, myth became mechanism for accountability. Pluck, pluck to crisp note signal a shift. And suddenly you are hearing how apprentices memorize these layered histories. The boy from last night returns, sitting opposite his master with a tiny Anjoni lute, plucking call and response, phrases that you realize correspond to mnemonic markers, each riff serving as a chapter heading in sonic shorthand. So an entire dynasty might be invoked by a four-note motif. The griot pauses mid-story to test the boy, firing questions in rapid Bambara dialect about trade taxes, river tolls, and the exact year a drought forced caravans to reroute from Kambi Sela to Alada. The boy answers in verse, never missing a beat, and you feel a thrum of collective pride ripple through the audience. You flash back to your own schooling flashcards, multiple choice sheets, and marvel at a pedagogy where memory lives in muscle and melody. The griot resumes, speaking of the great Mansa Musa's pilgrimage to Mecca, reiterating the mainstream fact that his gold gifts were so lavish they depressed Cairo's economy for years. But he adds a lesser-known aside. Some griots whispered, Musa traveled not merely for piety but to recruit scribes and architects because he feared oral memory might someday fail. A fringe claim contested by scholars who cite lack of written proof yet hinted at in certain Timbuktu manuscripts that reference Golden King's spoken libraries. Debate lingers: was Musa protecting heritage or centralizing it under royal? The script. You sense the griot slyly nudging that debate, reminding listeners that memory stored only in ink can burn, fade, or be locked away, whereas memory sung endures storms. His kora now shifts into a playful riff, recounting with sly humor how rival griots once held literal rap battles in market squares, testing each other's recall of cattle counts, meteor showers, and scandalous affairs. The loser forced to buy, the winner cola nuts. Laughter ripples through the circle as elders nod, remembering or at least claiming they do. The griot's fingers blur, and you notice the strings themselves are color-coded with dyed leather rings, another mnemonic device, red for war tales, blue for trade routes, white for spiritual lore. He plucks a red string, landing you in the middle of the famed Battle of Kirina, where Sundiata Kaida supposedly rode a white stallion blessed by hunters. The boy mirrors the motif on his Njuan, reinforcing the timeline. You catch yourself swaying, lulled yet alert. Dawn light filters through baobab branches now, detailing every groove in the drumskin beside you, and suddenly the griot stops mid-sentence, stares into the embers, and asks the village a question. What good is a king who forgets your name? Silence answers, thick as shea butter, before he continues, pointing out that a ruler who loses memory loses legitimacy, a philosophy historians term oral constitutionalism. Where the griots recall effectively limits tyranny. You feel the weight of that idea. Memory as political power. Breeze lifts ash into golden sparks. Children rub sleep from their eyes. The Griot begins winding down this segment, summarizing the moral: when you store history in living minds, you forge communal responsibility, because anyone may correct, anyone may recall, anyone may remind. He strums a final chord that vibrates in your chest like distant thunder. The boy echoes it, sealing lesson to heart. And as the chorus last note fades into morning birdsong, you realize you've witnessed not just storytelling but a marathon training session in the art of remembering kingdoms word for word, leaving you both humbled by human capacity and strangely comforted that somewhere, even as your phone forgets your passwords, entire empires still live inside a song. The silent archives beneath the baobab. You walk slowly now, not away from the fire, but in a gentle circle around it, letting the warmth graze your ankles and the fresh morning light soften the silhouettes of people still half curled on their mats. A few are awake, propped on elbows, heads resting on knuckles, watching the Griot the way one might watch the sunrise calmly, without rushing, knowing the light will stretch at its own pace. The boy with the ngoni yawns but stays seated, fingers absent-mindedly brushing over the taut strings as though even his hands aren't ready to sleep just yet. The Griot sits in stillness, his kora resting across his lap, his robe brushed with faint dust trails from the long night of performance. But then he lifts his head slightly and speaks, not to the fire, not to the circle of listeners, but toward a massive baobab tree at the village's edge, whose thick gray trunk curves like the shoulder of some ancient animal resting in silence. His voice is low now, more like a conversation than a tale. And you quickly realize you're hearing a story about the baobab itself, a tale not just of memory, but of the way memory takes root. He says the elders once believed every Griot's soul, when it passed on, circled back and settled into the bark of the tree, adding to its thickness. That's why some of the baobabs, he says, are so wide you can barely wrap your arms halfway around, because they are holding centuries of speech, pressed into their wood like a living archive. You blink, curious. It's a charming idea, even if it borders on myth. But here's your mainstream historical fact. In many West African societies, baobab trees were used as natural gathering points, both literal and symbolic. Griots often performed beneath them, as the wide canopies offered shade. The trunk provided a natural acoustic wall, and the tree's longevity gave a poetic link to ancestral wisdom. In villages lacking formal archives or libraries, these trees became the unofficial records office. But now comes your fringe fact, one that still causes academic side-eyes at conferences. Some Griot families claim that at the base of certain trees, particularly those near royal courts, actual objects are buried: carved memory stones, ritual tokens, or even bones of past Griots placed as anchors to protect the truth. These claims aren't confirmed by archaeology in any consistent way. And that's your scholarly debate. Are these oral claims metaphorical, or do they hint at an undocumented tradition of physical mnemonic aids hidden in nature? Some researchers dismiss them as symbolic, while others, more open to ethnographic layering, argue that dismissing such stories out of hand is its own kind of cultural blindness. You don't know which side is right. But standing here, watching, the Griot lift his hand toward the baobab and murmur a line of prayer in a language so old it feels like it belongs to the roots. You feel inclined to believe just a little. The Griot then turns his attention back to the gathering and begins to tell a new kind of tale, not one of kings, but of commoners, of a fish seller named Ciro who once made up a song to teach her children about price haggling at the riverside. The song, simple and repetitive, became so catchy that it spread across villages, eventually morphing into a mnemonic for calculating conversions between salt, dried fish, and millet. Traders would hum it under their breath as they counted out coins. It's a beautiful little reminder that griots didn't invent memory, they channeled it. The griot tells you that his great-grandmother learned Ciro's song and added a verse about taxes. His uncle added a verse about dishonest middlemen. He added one about drought seasons. And now the whole piece spans 35 verses and is sometimes used to teach children basic arithmetic. You find yourself wondering how many practical tools have been wrapped in rhyme over the centuries, hidden like medicine in honey. The griot pauses now to sip something steaming from a calabash bowl, his hand steady despite the long performance. You sit, cross-legged, your body finally relaxing into the dirt, your ears tuned to the rhythm of his breath. He begins again, this time with a quieter register, speaking of a town that once forgot its griot. He says the town grew wealthy, obsessed with merchants and maps, so they sent the old storyteller away to many tales. Not enough numbers, they said. But then came war, and then famine. And when the merchants tried to make sense of what What's happening? They found their maps empty, their books dry, their councils split. No one remembered how treaties were once made, or where the grain silos had been hidden during the last drought. They sent word to the Griot, who returned walking, carrying no books, no charts, only memory. And with it, they say, came stability. You feel that one? It's not a cautionary tale, it's a warning dressed in rhythm. The Griot smiles gently as if to say, that town could be anywhere. Then, as if on cue, he shifts again, talking now of the Griots who traveled, those who left their own villages to learn other traditions. It's said that one Griot in 1720 rode a camel caravan from the Niger River all the way to Fez in Morocco, learning new melodies and merging them with manned proverbs, creating a kind of portable cultural remix long before the internet made such things simple. Your mainstream fact here. Cultural blending between West African oral traditions and North African Arabic literacies happened for centuries, often through trade and pilgrimage. But here's your quirky detail. One traveling Griot was reportedly so persuasive that he convinced a Moroccan scribe to tattoo part of an epic poem on his own thigh, just to remember it during a particularly long dry season when writing tools were scarce. Whether true or not, it reveals something intimate, the lengths people go to not forget. And that's what this section is about. Really, not just remembering kings and genealogies, but preserving the things that might otherwise seem too small. To keep songs about fish prices, tales of forgotten towns, prayers whispered to trees, all stored not in scrolls or servers, but in people, living, breathing, sometimes singing archives who walk barefoot through centuries, leaving no footprint but memory. The Griot now hums the melody of Sira's fish song, and the boy picks it up on his Ngoni eyes bright in the gold-blue light of dawn. Around you, the audience begins to stir properly, now some stretching, some rising to fetch water, some simply sitting in quiet thought. You close your eyes briefly, letting the melody hang in the air like incense. This is not a performance. You've watched, it's a history you've joined. And somewhere, the baobab keeps listening. To Griots and the art of correcting King Zoo shift a little as the village fully wakes around you, pots clinking, roosters finishing their last declarations of dominance, and children pretending not to eavesdrop as they play near the edge of the gathering. But you stay close, and so do others, because the Griot hasn't stood yet. That means the story isn't done. He runs his thumb gently over the strings of the kora again, and the light clinking sound it makes feels like a breath between memories. This time, the story he chooses to tell is about a king, a real one, grand, powerful, robed in imported silks, feared by his rivals, loved by his people at least at first. But as the Griot begins to trace the arc of this king's rise, it becomes clear the tale isn't one of blind admiration. The Griot's voice stays steady, but there's a new kind of sharpness to his rhythm, as if the strings are tightening beneath the words, because this story is about the Griot's role as truth, even to those in power, especially to those in power. And that brings us to tonight's mainstream fact. In many West African courts, griots weren't merely entertainers, they were advisors, trusted counselors, keepers of legal precedent and diplomatic nuance. Some were so influential that foreign emissaries had to pass their words through a griot before being heard by the king. They were, essentially, the living constitution. But here comes your fringe fact. Griots also had a cultural license to embarrass kings, not cruelly, not publicly, but through clever song, whispered satire, or a very specific kind of performance called the correcting tale. These stories featured fictionalized characters who happened to share suspiciously similar traits with current rulers, and their fates served as gentle warnings. If a king grew greedy, a griot might tell of a leopard who tried to hoard all the waterholes and died of thirst. If a king silenced dissent, a tale might surface about a buffalo who stuffed cotton in its ears and wandered off a cliff. The cleverness of it was the deniability. The king could never officially accuse the griot of subversion, because the griot hadn't named him. But everyone knew that was the point. Griots were cultural breaks applying narrative pressure where speeches or swords might fail. You look around at the faces near you, especially the elders, and see a few of them nodding. They know, they've seen these tales used in real time, perhaps, or maybe just remembered. It's hard to say where memory ends and tradition begins. And here's your scholarly debate. Did griots truly have this power independently? Or were they always somewhat bound by the politics of patronage? Some argue that the griots' closeness to power, being paid by the court, housed in royal compoundsment, their corrective tales were toothless. Others point to stories and recorded oral histories where griots did challenge rulers, lived to tell about it. In one famous 18th century case, A Griot of the Carter Empire reportedly refused to bless a war the king was planning, reciting instead a tale of a past king who went to battle prematurely and lost both sons. The campaign was cancelled. The Griot, by the way, was rewarded with a ceremonial turban and a new hut, not punished. That's a thread to hold on to sometimes. Speaking truth isn't punished. Sometimes it's needed. The Griot by the fire is now singing softly a tune with only a few words but heavy meaning. It translates roughly to, even a drum will split if beaten too hard. It's a reminder that power like rhythm must be balanced. And suddenly you recall something from the earlier tale about Musa, that even the richest king needed storytellers to frame his glory. Without Griot's memory phrase, without correction, power rots. And this quiet rhythmic vigilance is the Griot's superpower. A balance of reverence and resistance, of tradition and challenge. That's not easy, not even in modern times. You think about how rare it is today to hear truth from those close to power, and how often we turn to satire and story to say what we can't in policy papers. Maybe we haven't changed that much. The Griot begins to tell now of a woman, yes, a female Griot, which surprises you, but it shouldn't, because here's another less-known fact. Women have long been part of the Griot tradition, called Griots. They often specialized in songs, lullabies, genealogies, and especially praise poetry, but many also acted as political commentators and historical archivists. One such woman, known only by her honorific Ma Fama, was said to have stood in front of her king in the mid-1800s and refused to sing for him until they released 3 unjustly imprisoned farmers. He did, and she sang. That story passed down in quiet villages and remembered only in the cadence of a specific praise poem, may never make it into a textbook, but it lives. And that's what you start to realize in this section. The Griot's role wasn't just to retell the past, it was to shape how that past informed the present. Not with judgment, not with scandal, but with a kind of sacred subtlety. They wove caution into admiration, wit into warning, and through it all, they reminded rulers and villagers alike that the story of a kingdom is not just built in palaces, but in how those palaces are remembered. The Griot pauses now. The fire has gone to ash. The boy with the Anjani is gone, perhaps, sent to sleep or off to fetch breakfast, but you stay seated. So does the Griot. There's still more. And as the morning light brightens into day, you realize you're not tired. Not really, because the stories haven't dulled you. They've steadied you, grounded you, anchored you in something older than print, deeper than data. You lean forward, waiting for what comes next. Because once you've heard how even kings were corrected by song, you begin to wonder what other silences have been hiding stories just waiting to be sung. The apprentice's trial by memory. The sun is fully awake now, spilling its early gold across the woven mats in the smooth earth. But the Griot does not rise. His shadow, cast long and lean beside the dormant fire pit, stretches toward a group of children lingering nearby, some giggling quietly, others pretending not to listen as they circle back toward the edge of the story. But the Griot, wise to all things both spoken and unspoken, lifts one hand and beckons a boy forward. Not the boy with the Anjani this time, a different one, taller, more nervous. His posture is stiff, as if he's trying to hide his heartbeat. Behind his ribs, this is no performance for fun. It is something heavier, a test, a rite. And you, comfortably seated with your legs crossed and your eyes adjusting to the brightness, suddenly realize you're about to witness a sacred milestone, an apprentice's first full recitation, a kind of oral final exam, where the stakes are memory and identity itself. The village hushes again. A woman stops pounding millet mid-rhythm. Someone herding goats leans on their stick and looks back over their shoulder. You do not breathe loudly. The boy stands in the center of the fire circle, the dust beneath his toes still warm from the night. The Griot gives him a single nod, and the boy begins. His voice is thin at first, more whisper than proclamation, but each word lands like a stone into a well. No script, no cue cards, just rhythm, breath, and the sheer inertia of practiced recall. He begins with a royal lineage, unbroken for 17 generations, reciting names and titles, their reigns, the alliances they forged, and the rivalries that cost them dearly. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Griot apprentices were often tested on genealogies and chronicles going back hundreds of years. In many West African cultures, particularly among the Mand peoples and the Wolof of Senegal, these oral histories served as official records of marriage legitimacy, property rights, and political legitimacy. An error in a single name could challenge someone's claim to land. So memory wasn't just performance, it was law. Now your quirky fact. In certain traditions, Griot apprentices would deliberately practice reciting history while walking backward in the dark. It wasn't superstition, it was training. The logic was simple. If you can walk blind while repeating the names of the past, your body starts associating direction with chronology. Left is older than right. North is for war. South is for trade. The body becomes a map, and this very concept embodying memory sits at the heart of this open-air oral exam. As the boy continues, his voice steadies. The crowd nods softly, some mouthing along with the stories. You realize the Griot isn't watching for errors. He's watching for tone, for the weight of the words. Can the boy recite not just the facts, but the feeling? Can he describe the famine that followed the third Sahelian drought with the kind of cadence that makes even a child's stomach tighten? Can he recount the humorous misadventures of a foolish courtier without losing the rhythm of the tale? The Griot lifts an eyebrow at a pause in the boy's tempo. There's a silence. The boy swallows. And then, miraculously, he recovers with a joke, a dry, almost sarcastic aside about a trader who married two sisters and ended up losing both to a crocodile, which also stole his sandal. The crowd laughs. The tension breaks. And in that moment, you witness not just memory, but style, interpretation, ownership, because the Griot's role is not to be a walking textbook, it's to make people care about what they remember. And here lies your scholarly debate. Some historians argue that these recitations, passed down orally, lack historical reliability, that they mutate over generations like whispers in a game. But others, especially scholars from within West Africa, argue the opposite, that the presence of living Griots ensures accuracy better than static texts. Book, once printed, cannot self-correct. A Griot, however, can be challenged, debated, corrected in real time. It's an ongoing act of consensus history, not as artifact, but as living community agreement. As you reflect on that, the boy approaches the climax of his recital, a tale of a legendary queen who defended her village against raiders by using coded songs to warn different districts. The queen, never named directly in written records, lives on solely in Griot memory. You glance at the Griot, who now sits still as stone, listening with a quiet gravity. The boy delivers the final lines. There is no applause, no triumphant drumroll, just silence, the kind that stretches across centuries. Then the Griot nods once, and the village exhales. The test is passed. The boy bows. No smile, just pride, laced with sweat. He has stepped through the veil between learner and keeper. You sense that from now on he will no longer sit behind the Griot, but beside him. The fire pit, though empty, still radiates a little warmth. You feel it in your spine. And though this story was not yours, not truly, it has now passed through your ears, too. That means it lives with you now. Somewhere, the Griot finally rises. He puts a hand gently on the boy's shoulder, not as reward, but as tradition. And then, looking out at the crowd, not just the gathered villagers, but at you, too, he says, softly, what is not spoken dies. You nod because now you understand. In this culture, forgetting isn't a passive accident, it's a betrayal. Remembering through voice, story, and rhythm is how the dead live. It's how the living are made accountable. It's how the future knows who built the roads it walks on. As the gathering disperses, you stay for just a little longer. The dust swirls lazily around your legs. The sun climbs steadily. Somewhere a new story is waiting its turn, and you are not ready to forget. Drum beats that carried secrets linger in the soft heat of morning, ears still ringing with the rhythm of the apprentice's voice. But as the village resumes its familiar hum, grinding millet, sharpening tools, the occasional bellow of a goat who thinks he's king, you notice something curious near the edge of the trees. A man, lean and deliberate in his movements, sits on a stool shaped like an old cow's vertebra. In front of him rests an hourglass-shaped drum, weathered and patched with years of care, but he doesn't beat it to make music. Instead, he plays code. His hands move with a steady, unhurried certainty. Thump, tap, tap, thump, thump, tap. It sounds like a lazy rhythm to your ears, maybe even a little random. But the Griot who now stands beside you chuckles and says, he just said good morning. To the next village. You blink, the drum is talking. The Griot nods slowly, his eyes never leaving the player. It says many things. Good morning, rain is coming. The apprentice passed his test. You smile, amused but skeptical. And so he offers you tonight's mainstream fact. In many regions of West Africa, particularly among the Yoruba, Ikan, and Monde peoples, talking drums were used for long-distance communication, Not metaphorically, literally, these drums replicated the tone and rhythm of spoken language, compressing phrases into recognizable acoustic patterns. Skilled drummers could send complex messages across miles, relayed by others in a chain of rhythmic telegrams. Villagers knew to listen. That's how festivals were announced, how kings summoned warriors, and how warnings traveled faster than feet. But your fringe fact is even more delicious. There are stories where whispered stories of griots using these drums to lie. Not maliciously, but strategically. A particularly famous tale tells of a griot who sent an encoded drum message that translated as "the chief invites peace," when, in fact, the chief had been ambushed and killed. Why the deception? To buy time. To prevent panic. To allow the village time to prepare for an enemy they now knew was coming. Was it dishonorable? That's where the scholarly debate comes in. Some historians argue that the drum, as an instrument of communal truth, should never be twisted. Others contend that griots were not just archivists but strategists, guardians of peace and survival, even if it meant bending the truth in sound. What's fascinating is that these debates aren't confined to dusty libraries. Even modern drummers in West Africa argue over this story's ethics in today's oral circles. What is the weight of a lie if it saves lives? The man with the drum shifts his rhythm, a different pattern now. The griot listens and smiles faintly. That one says, "Don't forget the yam harvest starts early this year." You almost laugh. There's something tender about the mundane, nestled beside the profound. A kingdom's lineage one moment, root vegetables the next. It's all part of the same tapestry. But there's more, because the griot begins to tell you that this form of drumming isn't just historical, it's emotional. In some traditions, drummers played to express grief in ways the tongue could not. During funerals, a family might request a drummer to recount the deceased's life not with words, but through tonal storytelling. Each beat, each pause, each tempo shift a memory, a eulogy without speech, a symphony of remembrance. The griot hums softly to illustrate. You don't understand the message, but you feel it, like sadness brushing past your cheek. And here's the next wrinkle. In some secretive griot enclaves, particularly among the Bozo people who lived near riverbanks, it's said that entire stories were encoded into rhythm, not just announcements, legends. These rhythms, complex and cyclical, were passed from drummer to drummer like sheet music of the ears. They could only be read by trained listeners, many of whom never spoke the tales aloud. You ask quietly if any of those drummers remain. The griot simply shrugs. Some say yes, but they will not play for tourists. You nod, understanding. This isn't showmanship, it's trust, a contract of sound, a silence wrapped around vibration. As you sit, your body slowly adjusts to the cadence around you. The sound of the drum is no longer just rhythm, it's conversation. It's as if the trees know when to rustle, as if the birds pause between verses. And it's all still storytelling even without a single word. The griot begins to describe a time, not so long ago, when colonial officials tried to ban talking drums. They feared insurrection. Too many messages, they said, too hard to intercept. But the griots were clever. They disguised messages as songs. They taught children to drum nursery rhymes that contained warnings hidden within the beats. So even as schools tried to teach proper history, the drums whispered truths at night. And so history survived not on paper, but in palms and calluses and carefully timed silences. You ask, quietly, if there's a way to learn the code. The griot considers this. Yes, he says, but you must learn to listen with your shoulders, not your ears. It makes no sense. But then again, neither did talking to trees, until yesterday. A small boy runs past, slapping a tin can with a stick in perfect time to the distant drum. He's not trying to mimic, he's answering. You realize this isn't nostalgia. It's not a museum piece. It's still alive, just quieter, hidden in daily rhythm. The griot stands, stretches, and says softly, "Come, it's time to eat." But you stay just a moment longer, watching the drummer send his final message before wrapping the instrument in cloth and walking away. You listen, not with your ears, with your whole body. Maybe, just maybe, you catch the tail end of a goodbye disguised as a proverb. Singing names into immortality. The smell of roasted peanuts wafts across the village now, mingling with the midday breeze and the distant crackle of firewood. But despite the calm, your thoughts remain anchored in the rhythm of that drum. How a beat could carry meaning like a whisper tossed across valleys. You find yourself walking again, slow and barefoot through dust warmed by the sun, trailing behind the griot like a quiet shadow. He pauses beneath a baobab tree, one so large it looks more like an ancient fortress than a plant, and there he speaks without warning. "Do you know," he says, "that in some places, if no one sings your name after you die, it means you never lived?" The question sits between you like a cold stone. He motions for you to sit, and then begins one of the most important lessons. Of all the naming songs, these aren't simple tunes. They are sonic fingerprints. A person's name, sure but woven into a tapestry of their deeds, their family, the tone of their voice, their favorite proverb, and sometimes even their greatest mistake. And here is your mainstream historical fact. In many West African oral traditions, particularly among the Fulani, Wolof, and Mandinka, individuals were honored through praise songs, musical oral poems that functioned both as biography and eulogy. These songs were passed down by griots, performed at weddings, funerals, and festivals. A praise name was more than a nickname, it was a kind of passport into collective memory. And for elite figures, these praise names could grow long and elaborate, recited in the form of structured poems with fixed meters, often performed with koro or balafon accompaniment. But your quirky fact: in some villages, praise songs were adapted in secret depending on how people actually felt about the person after death. If a man had been cruel, lazy, or dishonest, his praise song might be subtly altered, his heroic deed reduced to a minor anecdote, his bravado described with admiring hesitation. This was a cultural way of adjusting legacy without confrontation. After all, the dead cannot argue. Now for your scholarly debate. Historians and often disagree about how fixed these praise songs truly were. Were they memorized perfectly, word for word as sacred oral scripture? Or did griots alter them slightly over time, responding to the emotional temperature of the community? Some argue that griots operated like living editors, revising the past gently to better serve the present, smoothing over tensions, or adding spice where pride demanded. Others claim that changes are rare and frowned upon, as the griot's role is to preserve, not interpret. The truth likely lives between those theories. Griots are archivists, yes, but they are also performers, and performance lives in the moment. You listen now as the griot hums the beginning of a praise song for a long-dead queen. You don't understand the language, not fully, but you catch the pattern. Her name, followed by the place she was born, followed by three key deeds: brave, one generous, one humorous. The song ends not with her death, but with a proverb she was known to say: "When the hawk circles, even the lazy goat looks upward." You ask what it means. The griot shrugs. She believed fear could wake people better than ambition. The story lingers in the hot air, along with the sound of a string plucked absent-mindedly. What strikes you most is that these praise songs aren't just for nobles. Farmers, herders, blacksmiths, everyone gets remembered. A village elder might only be known in a handful of songs. A child who died young might be named only once during a festival. But in each case, the memory survives because it was sung, not written. And this is the griot's burden: to remember every name, even those history books overlook. Some griots are said to carry over 5,000 individual praise songs in memory. Can you imagine that? Your playlist holds a few hundred songs, at best, and even then, you forget lyrics. But a griot remembers songs tied to grief, to rain, to reconciliation. Songs for people who were never photographed, never mentioned in headlines, never Googled, yet they mattered because someone sang their name with meaning. You think of your own name now, how it might sound strung to a melody, surrounded by your best days and your most foolish ones. What story would it tell? What line would make a cousin nod knowingly or a stranger raise an eyebrow? Would it be worthy of retelling, even once a year? Under a tree like this one, the griot looks up suddenly. Would you like to hear your name sung? You hesitate, then nod. He doesn't ask again. He simply begins to chant, not your real name, of course, but the version of you that he has seen, the traveler with curious eyes, the silent observer, the one who listened to the drum instead of the gossip. His voice rolls low like thunder far away, each syllable drawn out, each phrase dancing just above understanding. There's humor in the middle, something about you tripping over your own feet and trying to act like it was intentional. You laugh, genuinely. And then, just like that, the song ends. It's not long, but it feels eternal. The griot says nothing else. He simply nods at you and stands, brushing dust from his robe. In his world, songs replace statues. Melodies are memory's sharpest tools. And for the first time, you realize, immortality isn't about living forever. It's about being remembered correctly. You walk back toward the village with the soft rhythm of your own name echoing in your mind. It may not be sung again, but it was sung once, and that to the griotes, enough. The Griot's silence is also a story. The afternoon sun now rests like a hot plate atop the wide sky, stretching long shadows beneath acacia trees and adobe rooftops. You walk through the quiet village once more, slower now, your thoughts filled with rhythms and names and invisible histories. At first, you think something's wrong. The market is still. The women pounding millet have paused, and even the goats seem to be lounging without complaint. But then you hear it. Nothing. Not silence in the usual sense, but a deliberate quieter hush with purpose. The griot is sitting once again in the storytelling circle, only this time, he isn't speaking. He's staring at the center of the circle, eyes half-lidded, his lips pressed together. Around him the villagers do not ask questions, they wait. You crouch beside a sleeping dog and do the same. And it dawns on you slowly. This too is part of the Griot's story. Because tonight's tale isn't about what he remembers, it's about what he refuses to say. And here's your mainstream historical fact. In many West African oral traditions, griots did not just speak to preserve history, they also used silence as a tool to communicate respect, grief, or protest. There were certain names they wouldn't say unless invited by ceremony. Certain events they'd only reference through metaphor. Griots were not chatterboxes, they were gatekeepers. And sometimes, the gate remained closed. Now your quirky fact. Among the Sira people of Senegal, it's said that some griots were trained to go completely mute for days after hearing particularly sacred or tragic news. This was not superstition, it was emotional calibration. Silence was seen as a sacred act, and necessary silence before reshaping words into memory. Some apprentices even took part in annual vows of quiet, during which they learned to sit in community without speaking, practicing what was called the silence of listening to the ancestors. And here enters tonight's scholarly debate. Modern scholars often struggle with interpreting the silences of oral traditions. Some see it as a flaw in documentation and absence, a void, but others argue that these silences are deliberate absences, full of meaning. One historian likened griot's silence to negative space in art you cannot understand. The story unless you understand what's not being said. You shift on your mat now, unsure whether to ask the griot what's on his mind, but an elder woman beside you offers an answer without being asked. He's remembering the ones who had no one left to sing for them. She whispers the forgotten. The weight of it settles into your chest like dust. You picture people who once lived, once sang, once danced beside fires like this, people whose names were never passed down. Maybe they died young, maybe they were poor, maybe they simply weren't interesting enough to make the cut. Whatever the reason, they faded, and the griot now mourns them through silence. Slowly he reaches into his satchel and retrieves a small, carved flute, no bigger than a twig. He plays a short tune, haunting, toneless, just 5 notes repeated softly. It's a lullaby, but not for the living. And then he speaks not a story, but a question. How do you remember someone who left no story behind? You don't know. But you wonder, what stories are already disappearing in your own life? What names have you forgotten that once meant everything? You think of that old neighbor who used to wave at everyone, or that aunt who told the same joke at every wedding. What happens when no one says their name anymore? The griot places the flute back into his satchel. He doesn't smile. He simply nods at the circle and stands. The story is over. Or maybe, this time it never began. And still it lingers. As the villagers return to their chores, you stay seated. Not because you're confused, but because something inside you, who understands, even without words. Silence is memory too. Just ask the trees. You walk later through the village outskirts, passing small grave markers, some decorated, some bare. The griot had pointed them out once, saying, each stone here once had a song. You pause before one that's worn down almost smooth. No name, no offering, just stone. You whisper your own name just once. Then someone else's. Someone you haven't thought about in years. It feels like a tiny rebellion against forgetting, as if, just for a second, your breath could carry their story a little further down the road. That night, as the fire crackles low and the stars begin to gossip above, the griot does something rare. He invites you to speak, not as a griot, but as a guest. Tell us something, he says, you think should not be forgotten. And the circle waits. You realize, with a quiet panic, that you don't know any long epics or family trees. No ancient names or political alliances. All you have are moments, so you tell one, a small memory, a gentle one. And for that night, in that circle, it is enough. The griot listens as if it were a prophecy. And when you finish, he simply nods and says, now it will be remembered. That's the secret, isn't it? You don't need drums or robes or ancestral permission. You just need to speak it aloud, even if it's small, especially if it's small. Because silence doesn't mean absence, it means the story is waiting for you to tell it. Somewhere in the quiet, the forgotten wait. Maps made of memory, not paper by morning. The quiet from the night before still clings to your skin like the dew soaking the edges of your robe. You wake not with a jolt, but with a slow stretch, your bones feeling more aligned with the rhythm of the earth than they've ever been. The Griot is already up, of course. He's seated cross-legged in the same spot beneath the baobab tree, nibbling a dried fig, staring out toward the horizon like he's watching ghosts commute to work. You sit beside him without asking. There's no need for words. He hands you a bit of fig and begins slowly, as though his thoughts are a donkey taking its time down a steep hill. You know, he says, without looking at you, we never needed paper to make maps. Our roads were made of stories, and just like that, your journey today is no longer about names or songs, it's about places. Not the kind you'd find with a compass and a degree in cartography, but places preserved in memory, passed down orally, layered with meaning the way cities are layered with centuries. And here's your mainstream historical fact. In much of pre-colonial West Africa, detailed knowledge of geography, routes, seasonal landmarks and political borders was maintained orally. No parchment, no ink. Griots, traders and elders used place-based storytelling to embed maps into people's memories. For instance, the Mande people were known to memorize vast distances between river crossings, resting trees, and invisible clan boundaries using chants or riddles. These mental maps were often sung, recited rhythmically, or built into genealogies. But the fringe fact takes us deeper. Among the signing people, it's said that some griots developed memory trails, a form of poetic cartography that strung places together not by distance, but by narrative tension. That is, if a king once lost a battle at a bend in a river, that bend became a narrative landmark. If a sacred tree offered shelter during a storm, it became part of a lullaby. Routes were not linear, they were emotional topographies, which brings us to your scholarly debate. Modern geographers often debate how accurate oral mapping was in the absence of fixed visual references. Could an entire route be truly memorized and passed on accurately for generations? Or were these maps more symbolic, prone to drift and mythologization? Some argue the oral maps were more reliable because they were actively rehearsed, layered into songs, and adjusted seasonally. Unlike printed maps, which could go outdated quietly, oral maps stayed alive. Others claimed these oral pathways sacrificed precision for poetic rhythm. After all, what's easier to remember, a turn at 3.2 kilometers northeast of a ridge, or a tree where the wind always whispers your father's name? You now follow the Griot along a narrow footpath. He stops often, not to rest but to point things out with his memory. This is where the zebra lay down in the drought of 42, he says, gesturing to a spot where there's no visible trace. A few steps later, this patch of ground, here, still remembers the wedding drums of Sorekata's daughter. You're about to ask how dirt can remember, but you've learned better by now. He turns and teaches you a children's rhyme. It goes something like, from the shade of two trees to the place where snakes cross, then past the rock shaped like a hyena's sneeze. That's where the generous man sleeps. It sounds like nonsense, until you follow it, and realize he's just directed you to the village cemetery. You chuckle. He grins. That rhyme is hundreds of years old, still works, still maps. And here's something even more peculiar. Griots were known to adjust stories to reflect changes in geography. If a flood washed away a road, the narrative adapted. If a new ruler built a canal, the tale now included a river of mirrors commanded by the hand of a man. These updates weren't errors, they were edits. Not unlike updating a GPS, except this one came with better music. Later you reach a bend in the path and notice a stack of stones, oddly arranged. The Griot taps it once with his staff and says, "This is the pile that tells us the kingdom ends here." You raise an eyebrow. There's no signpost, no fence, just rocks. But to a Griot, that's as clear as a passport checkpoint. The Griot goes on to explain how certain clans kept entire itineraries in verse form. Griots could recite the journey from Timbuktu to the coastal markets of Bazaar, not by referencing physical maps but by reciting a route song filled with line breaks that corresponded to specific oases, villages, or danger zones. One historian, in the 1980s, tried to follow such a route and found it startlingly accurate, even down to when to leave based on bird migrations mentioned in the song. But the Griot now tells you of another kind of map, the personal one. He says everyone carries a map in their mind, made not of roads but of moments. Where did you cry for the first time away from home? He asks. Where did you learn to cook something without being told? Where did someone lie to you in a way that changed everything? You stare at him, unsure if you're supposed to answer. He continues anyway. That is your real country. You walk a bit more, noticing how your feet instinctively adjust to pebbles and roots. And maybe, for a second, you understand Griots didn't just memorize stories to impress. They kept these oral maps because they were more than paths. They were relationships. You didn't walk from place to place. You walked from memory to memory. And maybe that's the greatest lesson of the Griots' mental cartography. You can print a map on paper, but it will never remember the sound of your grandfather's laugh beneath the kapok tree. Only a story can do that. The apprentice who remembered too much. You wake before dawn this time, stirred not by the crow of a rooster or the crackling of firewood, but by a strange, persistent whispering. Not threatening, more like someone muttering lines to themselves. Again and again, trying to wrestle slippery words into shape. You step outside, and there in the half-light you see a boy, maybe 12, maybe 15. His face carries the unsure gravity of someone trying very hard to appear older than he is. He's pacing beside the Griots' hut, barefoot, lips moving without sound. It's clear what he's doing, reciting, over and over, as if forgetting even one syllable would be a sin. The Griot himself watches from the shadows, arms crossed. And just like that, your day becomes a lesson not in performance, but in apprenticeship. Today is about how a Griot is made, and as the apprentice stumbles over a line, something about the names of a line of kings from centuries ago, you realize you're witnessing something sacred, memory under construction. Here's your mainstream historical fact. West African Griots, particularly in regions like Mali, Senegal, Guinea, and Gambia, were not merely born into their roles. They were trained, often from early childhood, through intensive oral memorization. Entire families were sometimes dedicated to the Griot craft, with roles passed down across generations. Children were not simply taught stories, they were taught how to breathe them, how to chant them, how to feel them. Apprenticeship could last decades, and it often began with silent. Young Griots weren't allowed to speak in public performances until they had proven their memory, rhythm, and sensitivity to nuance. But your quirky fact: in some traditions, Griot apprentices were required to undergo story fasting, a ritual period of total silence, during which they were bombarded with stories but forbidden to retell them aloud. The idea was to build pressure, like a dam holding back a flood. When the moment finally came to speak, the words would come not from memory but from the soul. And yes, there's an open scholarly debate here too. Some researchers argue that such intense oral training led to overcompression of knowledge, where young Griots began blending tales together by accident or forgetting the emotional tone of older versions. Others say that's the whole point. Griots weren't photocopiers, they were filters. The best Griots didn't just recite, they interpreted. They adjusted a tale for the mood of the crowd, for the weather, for the season. In this view, the apprentice who made small changes wasn't failing, he was evolving. You sit now beside the boy as he fumbles again through the reign of a king named Nyankuma, who apparently loved war almost as much as mangoes. He stops, frustrated. I always forget the part about the mangoes, he mutters. They're not important. But the elder Griot shakes his head gently. They're the most important part, he says. The people already remember the war. What they forget is that kings also laughed, and ate too many mangoes, and once got stung by bees while bathing. The apprentice looks up, surprised. That happened. It did now, the Griot says with a wink. You learn that part of a Griot's education is in choosing what not to remember. Not every detail matters, but the right detail, the one with color, with smell, with rhythm, that one anchors the memory like a stake in the earth. You follow the boy later as he runs errands for his teacher, delivering gourds of water, carrying baskets of baobab leaves, collecting firewood. But all the while, he's murmuring to himself, under his breath, lists of names, titles, battles, births and deaths. He's memorizing not for tests or grades, but for honor, for duty, for legacy. The Griot explains later that when the apprentice finally performs for the first time, it will not be in front of strangers, but before the elders of the village. And if he fails, not by forgetting a line, but by losing the feeling, he'll to have to begin again, not just the tale, but his apprenticeship. You think of your own childhood then, how you learned things: flashcards, exams, textbooks. Did you ever memorize something so deeply it felt like part of your blood? Did anyone ever test you not for accuracy, but for emotion? You realize how different this world is, and how profoundly human it is at the same time. You sit with the apprentice again at dusk. He tries a story once more. This time he includes the mangoes. He describes Nyankuma as a fierce leader who once negotiated peace while sticky with juice, who made treaties with laughter still on his chin. You smile, he's getting it, you can tell. Later, the elder Griot leans toward you and whispers, he's almost ready. He just doesn't know it yet. You watch the boy run home, skipping a little in the dimming light. The Griot adds, but first, he'll have to make his own mistake. They all do. That night, the fire crackles as the villagers gather again. The apprentice watches quietly from the side, mouthing along with every story, every rhythm, every pause. You look at him and wonder, what tale will he one day carry that no one else can? What truth will be his alone to remember, and to pass along when his own beard turns gray? And suddenly, you understand why griots are trained not just to speak, but to wait. Memory is a living creature, and before you can teach it, you have to let it know you're listening. Instruments that remember when you can eat. You stretch your legs as the coals from the night's fire crackle lazily in their earthen bed. It's one of those soft, hazy mornings where the air itself feels like it's humming with leftover dreams. You rub the sleep from your eyes, still thinking about the apprentice and his mango-loving king. The village is slowly waking up, but you notice something different today. A sound. Not a voice, not a bird, not a goat. A stringed vibration, deep and sweet, rising from somewhere behind the Griot's hut. You follow it instinctively, and that's when you see it. The Griot seated with a broad instrument across his lap. It's wooden, worn smooth by years of handling, with gourd resonators underneath and taut strings that shimmer in the light. His fingers dance over it like raindrops, and though he hasn't said a word, you know exactly what's happening. Today, the story isn't spoken, it's played. And so begins your lesson in how griots used instruments not just to accompany stories but to remember them. Today you're stepping into the world of sonic memory. First, your mainstream historical. In fact, the kora, a 21-stringed harp lute traditionally used by griots across West Africa, especially among the Mandinka people, is more than a musical instrument. It's a memory device. Each tuning, each phrase, each plucked note corresponds to particular stories, lineages, or emotional states. Griots used the kora to mark the start of a tale, to evoke sorrow or celebration, even to substitute for speech entirely. A tune could announce a funeral, a birth, or a call to justice without a single word. But here's your quirky fact. Some griots were known to name their instruments and believed that certain koras remembered better than others. It was said that if you played the same story on two koras, one might forget a part of the tale or twist its mood. Elders swore that the best koras had strings tuned with sweat and grief, meaning they'd absorbed generations of sorrow and joy, and thus could recall those emotions better than the player ever could. And yes, there's a scholarly debate to go with it. Modern ethnomusicologists disagree on whether the structure of griot music truly encodes historical data or if it's more symbolic, a tool for emotion, not information. Some argue that the notes correspond to mnemonic triggers for specific names or events, making the music an actual archive. Others see it as interpretive, a kind of historical mood board rather than a transcript. Still, griots themselves never made that distinction. To them, music was memory. If the words failed, the strings wouldn't. The griot now teaches you a basic tune, just a few plucked notes in a repeating pattern. He hums along softly, and though you don't understand the melody, your body does. Feels like walking home in the rain. Like a story that doesn't need a plot, just a feeling. He explains that certain musical patterns are used to announce ancestral lines, while others mark tales of tricksters, warriors, or healers. Some rhythms are even coded to signal danger, deception, or forgiveness. And more fascinating still, in some regions, griots didn't just use stringed instruments. They used talking drums, or glass-shaped drums that could mimic the tonal inflections of human speech. These drums were used to speak sentences across long distances, warning neighboring villages or summoning guests to ceremonies, but in the hands of a griot, they also became storytelling tools. One old griot once told a researcher, "When the drum talks, it remembers the days I was too tired to sing." As the sun rises higher, the griot picks up another instrument, a kind of wooden xylophone with gourd resonators. He taps out a sequence that sounds, oddly, like laughter. He grins. "This one tells jokes," he says. You raise an eyebrow. "It does," he shrugs. "You just don't speak its language yet." The balafons, clacks, and taps form patterns that accompany stories of trickster spirits and clever wives. In fact, the balafon was often used by griots when telling morally ambiguous tales, ones where nobody ends up fully good or evil. The complex rhythms allowed listeners to feel the gray areas, and you realize something subtle. These instruments aren't decorations. They're as essential to the story as verbs or names. They hold the pauses, they hold the sighs, they hold the unspeakable. You try your hand at the balafon, and though your rhythm is clumsy, the griot nods approvingly. The wood doesn't care if you're perfect, he says. It just wants you to be honest. You end your lesson under a neem tree, sweat on your brow, fingers sore, heart full. You didn't learn to play an instrument. You learned to listen to one. And in doing so, you've unlocked a new kind of memory, one that doesn't rely on being clever, or fluent, or loud, just open. That evening, as the villagers gather again, the apprentice sits beside the griot, but this time, the elder doesn't tell a story. He plays, and the boy listens with his eyes closed, mouthing the lines silently, as if the music itself is prompting his memory. At one point, the tune shifts, and you recognize it, the Mango King's melody. The boy smiles. The griot doesn't need to speak. The instrument has taken over. The story survives. And somewhere in the echo of strings and wood and memory, you understand that griots didn't carry their legacies in scrolls or scroll cases. They carried them in sound. In the texture of a string, the tone of a drum, the reverberation of a hollow gourd. Instruments don't forget, after all, not when they're played with care, and certainly not when they've been tuned with generations of love and loss. When the griot refused to speak, it's a strange evening tonight. The air feels thick, not with heat, but with something else, expectation maybe. You sense it in the way the birds quiet early, in the way the apprentice griot hums nervously to himself while rearranging the firewood. Even the elder griot seems heavier, quieter than usual. He sits apart from the usual gathering place beneath the baobab tree, his kora untouched at his side, a deep furrow between his brows. Something is different. Something is about to happen, not happen. Because tonight's story is about silence, not the comfortable, sleepy kind that wraps you up in soft sounds and crickets, but the kind that falls like a curtain, the kind that leaves an entire village holding its breath. Tonight, you learn what it meant when a griot chose not to speak, and as you settle in closer to the firelight, your ears straining toward a story that hasn't begun yet, it feels more like a warning than a performance. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Griots were not just storytellers or entertainers. They were public historians, spiritual advisors, social critics, and occasionally, moral judges. In times of conflict or injustice, a griot's words were held immense power. Their refusal to speak was a kind of protest, a social alarm bell louder than any drum. Silence from a griot was rare and terrifying because it meant something had gone so wrong. Even memory itself refused to cooperate. But here's your fringe, quirky fact. In some West African traditions, when a griot went silent in public, no one was allowed to perform music or tell stories until the silence was broken. It was as though the act of storytelling itself had gone into mourning. Children were forbidden from singing, drums were muted, and dances postponed. The community would respond with gifts, apologies, or public rituals in hopes of coaxing the griot's voice back. And now the scholarly debate: did this ritual silence reflect the griot's personal disapproval, or was it a symbolic gesture orchestrated by the elders? Some argue that griots operated with total autonomy, deciding when and how to speak based on personal ethics. Others believe such silences were community-driven performances, using the griot as a mouthpiece for collective discontent. The evidence varies by region. And like all things griot, the truth may lie in the middle, spoken through gesture rather than sentence. You look now at the fire, at the waiting villagers who seem unsure whether to sit or disperse. The griot remains motionless. Then, after what feels like a full hour of flickering silence, the apprentice approaches him. The boy kneels quietly, doesn't say a word. Instead, he places a folded piece of cloth bright embroidered down to the elder's lap. You don't recognize the symbol on it, but the griot does. He stares at it, breathes deeply. Still, he says nothing. It's clear now this silence is intentional. And as you learn, griot silence wasn't always about protest. Sometimes it was grief. Griots weren't supposed to show emotion openly during storytelling, especially when recounting painful or shameful events. But when a griot's own memory became too heavy, say the death of a student, the destruction of a village, they might enter a period of voice fasting. It was never announced. It simply happened, and everyone knew to respect it. Elders say that during a famous drought in the 19th century, a griot of the Jollof kingdom refused to speak for 7 weeks after watching half his village starve. He sat each night at the usual place but uttered not a word. People still gathered, still lit the fires, still brought food offerings. On the 49th night, he picked up his anjoni, played one song, and said, "Let the sky remember what we cannot say." That was all, and it was enough. Back in your present moment, The apprentice now pulls out a second item from his pouch, a broken drumstick, smoothed at the end by years of use. He places it gently beside the kora. This, apparently, is what the griot was waiting for. With a sigh that's more than just tired lungs its release, he picks up his instrument. Still no words, but he plays. A slow, low melody, something you've never heard before. It sounds like raindrops on empty bowls, like distant hoofbeats in sand. It's a story, clearly, but it's being told through absence. The griot is teaching tonight without speaking. And the lesson is this: sometimes silence is the story. You begin to realize just how carefully griots wielded their silence. It was not avoidance, it was precision. Just as important as what was said was what was not said. A pause in a story could hint at shame, mystery, or unresolved tension. One scholar once wrote, "A griot's greatest weapon is not his voice but his refusal to use it." And now you feel it in your bones. Silence here isn't a lack of sound, it's a ritual space. It invites listening on a deeper level, and just as your mind begins to wander, the griot plucks 3 final notes and then finally speaks. "There are some stories," he says, "that only live when we leave space for them." And then he smiles, faintly. The silence has passed, but it wasn't empty. It was full. Full of memory, full of intent, and full of the lesson that not all power comes from being heard. Some power comes from knowing when not to speak. That night, you fall asleep to a hush, not just outside but within you. You dream, not of battles or mangoes or rivers that sing, but of a mouth closed gently in wisdom, and a heart that speaks in silence. The ceremony of remembering everything the next day arrives, not with the usual goat bleating or rhythmic thump of a pestle grinding millet, but with a strange tension in the air. Something big is about to happen. You can tell by the way people move, a little faster, a little more upright, whispering more than talking, carrying bowls of water and woven mats with purposeful care. You ask the apprentice what's going on, and his eyes brighten with a mixture of excitement and nerves. "It's the ceremony of remembering," he says. "It only happens once a season unless someone important dies or someone important is born." And just like that, you're drawn into the day where memory isn't just spoken, it's celebrated. Where griots don't just tell stories for listeners, they tell them for the sake of the ancestors, the unborn, and everyone in between. It's a ceremonial download of collective memory. You follow the villagers to the ceremonial clearing, a wide open circle ringed by baobab trees and shaded by palm fronds laced with bits of colored cloth. There's no stage, no microphones, no posters, but somehow everyone knows exactly where to sit. As people settle into place, there's a quiet hum of anticipation. It's not unlike the hush before a symphony begins. Only here, the instruments are voices, hand claps, drums, and breath. Now for your mainstream historical fact: West African societies, particularly the Monde Wolof and Sura peoples, held formal storytelling gatherings often tied to lunar cycles, agricultural events, or life milestones. Griots would gather to recount entire genealogies, historical migrations, founding myths, and moral tales, not just for entertainment but as an act of cultural preservation. These gatherings could last hours, even days, and were essential to maintaining communal identity. But today's quirky twist: in some ceremonies, griots would recite not just human histories but the stories of animals, rivers, and even trees. One famous griot from Mali claimed he could trace the lineage of a sacred baobab tree back 7 centuries, including the names of every chief who had ever tied a goat to it. Listeners didn't roll their eyes, they nodded solemnly. Because in this tradition, memory is not limited to people. It's layered into the landscape, the wind patterns, the rhythms of birdsong. Everything has a story, and the griot's job is to listen long enough to learn it. As the ceremony begins, the griot steps into the center of the circle, not grandly but gently, like a leaf settling onto water. He carries no props, just his voice, and the first words out of his mouth are not a king's name or a date but a welcome, not just to the villagers, but to the ancestors listening through the trees. You feel a chill, not from fear, but from reverence. He begins with a lullaby. Yes, a lullaby. Not for babies, but for memory itself. "Sleep not, O story," he chants, "for we are here to carry you. It's haunting, it's beautiful." It sets the tone. Then he starts tracing the lineage of the local ruling family, beginning not with the most recent chief but with a woman from long ago, a market matriarch, who once convinced a neighboring village to avoid war by sending them fermented honey in clay jars. That honey, he says, is still remembered in the soil, because sweetness, when shared, is stronger than the sword. You glance around and notice something else: people are mouthing the story with him. They know it, word for word. And yet, they still gather to hear it aloud, again and again. It's not about surprise, it's about sync, about being in rhythm with your past. Then comes a debated point in the narrative: a cousin's betrayal, a contested succession. And here's your open scholarly debate. Modern historians studying oral traditions often struggle with versions. Was the cousin's betrayal a literal coup, or was it a symbolic tale of a community disagreement about land? Griots don't offer footnotes, they offer feeling. Some academics argue that this introduces error and historical distortion, but others argue the opposite, that this living, breathing retelling of history reflects not distortion, but emotional truth. That we remember best what moved us most, even if the facts shift slightly in the telling. The griot doesn't avoid this debated point. In fact, he performs the debate itself by switching voices. He tells both sides of the story, playing both the cousin and the chief, arguing across generations, letting the audience laugh, hiss, and nod along. In this version, contradiction isn't a flaw, it's a feature. Later in the ceremony, the apprentice is invited to contribute. He hesitates, then steps forward, clutching a balafon mallet like it's a sword. He tells a short, clumsy tale about a cow that refused to leave a rice field and how the farmer eventually bribed it with singing children. It's not epic, it's not perfect, but the crowd cheers, because now he is part of the circle and so are you. The ceremony continues well into the night, punctuated by food, drink, and the occasional outburst of improvised verse. And you notice that as people grow tired, the griot's voice doesn't get louder, it gets softer, almost like a whisper. Like the story is folding in on itself, becoming internal. You close your eyes, you feel the thump of the drums in your chest, the swish of woven fans, the crackle of firewood. You are not an outsider anymore, you're a vessel, a page in the book of tonight. When it finally ends, the griot concludes not with the end, but with, "May the next voice carry this." And then, silence. You breathe out slowly. The apprentice sits beside you. "He left that part for me," he says. "I'm going to learn it." You nod. That's how it works. Not with recordings or scrolls or apps, but with people, with gatherings, with remembering together. And you understand something deep now. Memory, here, is not about looking back. It's about belonging. The griot's first mistake and why it mattered at night. As the stars stretch lazily across the West African sky and the village settles into its nighttime rhythm of flickering firelight and hushed voices, you find yourself sitting beside the apprentice, who is unusually quiet. He's been practicing the melody from the ceremony of remembering, but his hands tremble on the strings. "I made a mistake," he mumbles. "I said the wrong name." You pause, unsure what to say. After all, how bad could it be? Names shift. Memories fade, but the look on his face says otherwise. He is devastated. And it's not just embarrassment. In the world of griots, getting a name wrong can change the course of memory itself. This evening, you're about to explore something you hadn't yet considered: the fragility of oral tradition, and the sacred weight griots placed on accuracy. But as you'll soon learn, perfection isn't the point, responsibility is. Let's begin, as always, with your mainstream historical fact. Griots were trained for years before being allowed to speak at formal gatherings. Memorization drills, recitation under pressure, and vocal training were part of their daily regimen. A single mistake in recounting a genealogy or a historical event could not only embarrass the griot, but offend entire families, because history here wasn't an abstract idea, it was personal. Naming someone's ancestor incorrectly was like erasing them from the community's legacy. But here comes your fringe fact. Despite the pressure, griots were expected to adapt when mistakes happened. There are accounts of griots who, upon realizing they had spoken a wrong name or sequence, would immediately shift the rhythm or invent a small parable on the spot to cover the error, essentially disguising a mistake as part of the performance. One famous griot in Senegal once flubbed a king's birth order, and quickly spun a poetic explanation that the king had been reborn in spirit through his own son, thus justifying the out-of-order lineage. It worked. The audience applauded. The error, in effect, became part of the mythos. Still, the seriousness of getting it wrong wasn't dismissed lightly, which brings us to the scholarly debate. Did griots preserve history accurately, or did they shape it to fit the moment? Historians wrestle with this, especially since written documentation in many West African societies was sparse compared to the vast oral records. Some scholars argue that griots weren't just transmitters of facts, but curators of relevance, blurring stories to reflect the needs or values of their listeners at that time. Others, especially those from within the cultures themselves, insist that accuracy, especially in names and events, was non-negotiable. and any deviation was either a sign of youthful inexperience or a symbolic choice made with great care. Back to your worried apprentice, who has just misnamed the mother of a founding chief. You watch as he trembles, and the elder Griot approaches, his face unreadable. You expect a scolding. Instead, the elder Griot sits beside the apprentice, picks up the kora, and plays the melody the boy had practiced. Then, gently, he sings the correct name twice. The first time softly, the second time with a tiny smile. The string remembers, he says, handing the instrument back. So do you. You realize something. In Griot tradition, mistakes are not the end, they're a threshold. A signal that the student is finally ready to feel the full weight of the role. Until now, the apprentice was memorizing. Tonight he learns to carry memory. Not flawlessly, but responsibly. And you begin to see how griots weren't only memorizing histories, they were interpreting them under pressure, juggling emotion, political nuance, audience expectation, and truth. It's an incredible balancing act. One griot you hear about was famous for inserting hidden jokes when recounting long battle histories. He'd mention a brave warrior who conquered entire armies before losing a foot race to his wife, and everyone would laugh except the warrior's descendants, who always looked slightly smug. Was it true? No one knows, but the lesson endured, which in griot logic was often more important than the literal detail. You ask the elder griot how often he's made a mistake. He grins. I've forgotten more stories than you've eaten dinners, he says, but the people help me remember, and when they don't, the trees do. You blink the trees. He nods seriously. You lean against a baobab long enough. It'll tell you what you missed. You laugh, but not entirely. Something about the way he says it makes you think he means it. You spend the rest of the evening listening to the apprentice gently repeating the story he flubbed this time correctly over and over. No one mocks him, no one corrects him. The village simply lets him remember, in his own rhythm. By morning, his voice has grown stronger, his hands steadier, and you understand something deeper now. Memory isn't just what griots preserve, it's what they repair, day after day. A tradition this old doesn't survive because it's perfect. It survives because it's forgiving, because someone is always willing to retell, relearn, and reweave the threads. The apprentice catches your eye as the sun rises and nods toward the fire. Want to try a line, you hesitate, but then you speak. The words feel strange in your mouth, heavy with syllables you don't quite own, but you say them anyway. The elder griot nods. Now it remembers you too, he says. And that's the truest thing you've heard all week. Singing the weather and naming the winds as another twilight folds over the village and the sky turns to indigo. You lie flat on a woven mat under a swaying awning of palm leaves. Tonight feels different, warmer, softer, as if the very air has something to say. The trees rustle in patterns too specific to ignore. The wind pushes in small bursts from the west, making the chorus strings hum slightly even when no one's touching them. You sit up, eyes catching the apprentice, who seems to be arranging gourds in a half circle, muttering to himself. It's time for the wind songs, he says, not looking up. You think he's joking, singing to the weather. Surely not. But then the elder griot appears, barefoot and humming, and once again, your expectations are tossed aside, like husks from a roasted ear of maize. Because tonight, you'll learn that griots didn't just preserve the histories of kings and warriors. They also preserved the behavior of the skies. And the wind, in particular, had a name, a rhythm, and sometimes even a scandalous past. Here's your mainstream historical fact. West African griots were repositories not just of human history but of ecological knowledge. They memorized the changing seasons, the timing of rains, the signs of approaching droughts, and the behavior of local birds and insects. Their stories contained environmental cues. A certain phrase might describe a seasonal shift. A specific animal reference might signal a time to plant or harvest. Long before meteorological satellites, griots were the village's walking forecast. And now for the quirky fringe fact. In some regions, griots assign personalities and names to the different winds, much like you'd describe troublesome cousins. The harmattan wind, for example, a dry, dusty gust that blows from the Sahara, was often personified as a jealous widow, who threw tantrums in January and stole moisture from the soil. Children were taught to greet her politely or risk waking up with cracked lips. Some griots even sang specific songs to calm her down and coax a gentler breeze. Imagine a bedtime lullaby for the atmosphere. The idea wasn't just metaphorical. These songs became cues for farmers and traders, or all climate indicators embedded in folktales. And here comes your open scholarly debate. Were griot wind songs symbolic poetry, or were they practical mnemonic devices disguised as myth? Some scholars argue that by wrapping environmental data in story, griots ensured important information could be remembered across generations, even when literacy was rare. Others suggest that the songs were more spiritual in nature, attempts to influence weather patterns, not just record them. In truth, it may have been both, science and spirituality braided together like reeds in a thatched roof. Tonight's performance begins not with instruments, but with whistling. The elder griot and his apprentice take turns, imitating wind sounds, with remarkable precision, soft sighs for the coastal breeze, erratic chirps for mountain gusts, long howls for the harmattan. They don't explain, they just perform. You watch as the villagers close their eyes, as if syncing their minds to the movement of air itself. Then the songs begin, each one short and strange, full of nonsense syllables and rhythmic repetition. But hidden in the melody are details. When the rooster walks backward, the rain will fall in 3 days. If the acacia twists twice in a night, wait 2 moons before planting. Listen when the termite mound hums, it remembers what the clouds forget. It's like decoding weather through poetry. And somewhere in the middle of this wind serenade you remember something odd you saw earlier. A girl tying a feather to the corner of her hut's roof. You ask the apprentice later, and he nods. That's how we listen to the quiet winds, he says. The ones that don't have voices yet. And suddenly it hits you, the griots weren't just collecting stories. They were recording the unspoken, giving shape to invisible forces through narrative. To you it might seem superstitious, but to them it's data with a soul. The most surprising part of the night, when the elder griot pauses the performance and gestures to a pot of warm millet beer. He lifts it, sniffs the rim, and declares, "Too early for the mango wind." Everyone laughs. You're lost. Turns out, in this village, a certain southeast breeze brings early fruit rot, and you can smell its arrival in how fermented drinks behave. Not a scientific instrument in sight, and yet somehow, the griot just did better forecasting than a smartphone app. There's a part of the performance where the apprentice tells a short story about a boy who tried to trap the harmattan in a jar to impress his grandmother. The wind escapes, causes chaos, and ends up rearranging the village's entire yam harvest. The moral, the apprentice says, with a wink, is never underestimate a jealous widow with dry feet. Everyone roars with laughter. Even the fire seems to flicker in approval. But behind the joke is a serious truth. Knowledge of nature here isn't just practical, it's intimate. They know the wind like a family member, and griots make sure no one forgets her moods. As the performance winds down, the elder griot sings a closing line so soft you almost miss it. If tomorrow forgets to whisper, remind it with your breath. You exhale. The night has been gentle but wild. You're not sure what you've learned, but you feel like you've remembered something you've never been taught. Later, lying down again under the palms, you hear the faintest whistle, not from a person, from the world. You smile. Somewhere out there the harmattan widow is listening too, and tomorrow she might bring dust, or song, or both. When memory was currency, not ceremony tonight, as you sit beside the apprentice weaving thin strips of bark into a basket frame. Because apparently everyone is expected to be mildly handy in this village, you start to notice a subtle shift in the way people are talking. Not just about the stories or songs, but about favors owed, trust earned, and most curiously, memories traded. It's subtle, like a background hum, but once you tune in, you realize griots don't just perform history, they spend it, and not metaphorically. Welcome to a concept you didn't expect: a memory as currency. Not coin, not shells, not beads. Memory. Word perfect, storied, performable memory. You glance at the apprentice, who is muttering a string of names as he works. You ask what he's doing. "Paying my debt," he says simply. "My uncle loaned me a camel when I was 12. I promised to recite his mother's naming story at his next birthday. That's the deal." You blink. That's a thing. Yes, it is. And you're about to spend the next night understanding how in this world, remembering isn't just a skill, it's a social contract. Let's start with the mainstream historical fact. In many West African societies, griots were not just storytellers or performers, they were mediators, diplomats, and negotiators. In cultures where written contracts were rare, griots were entrusted to remember agreements between families, clans, and villages. Marriages, land borders, inheritance lines, and trade deals could all be maintained through oral contracts, sealed not with ink but with public recitation. And here's the kicker. Once a griot publicly declared a deal, it was considered binding, because the memory of it would be held in the social record, echoing through retellings and acknowledgments. Now for the delightfully quirky fringe fact. Griots were sometimes paid not in money, but in secrets. Want a griot to speak well of your family during a dispute? You might give them a family tale, a birth anomaly, or a forgotten ancestor's brave deed. These memory gifts weren't just gossip, they were leverage. The more vivid and unusual the story, the more value it carried in future storytelling. One griot was famously gifted a song about a horse that cried during thunderstorms, supposedly because it remembered a past life as a herder. That song, performed at weddings, became so beloved that the family's social standing rose because of it. They were descendants of the thunder horse. Not bad for a quirky anecdote. But now comes your scholarly debate. Was this system of memory-based social value a form of power consolidation, or a collective cultural safety net? Some scholars argue that griots became kingmakers and manipulators, with a well-placed story or omission. Others suggest that the public nature of their memory role made them accountable, and thus trustworthy in a way written documents could never be, because the community itself acted as a living archive. If a griot lied, dozens of listeners could correct them. The memory wasn't isolated, it was communal. Back to the village tonight. The elder griot is overseeing a settlement. Two families are in quiet dispute over the placement of a granary that, depending on who you ask, encroaches on ancestral land or was intentionally placed as part of a marriage agreement to generations ago. No one is yelling, no one is holding a scroll. Instead, the elder griot listens to each side's version of events, nodding occasionally. Then he begins to chant, not from a scroll or a list but from his own recollection of that marriage, that land, that long ago conversation between two now dead men under a mango tree. The chant includes names, gifts, even what the groom wore, a blue tunic with 3 gold tassels and nervous fingers. And then, the clincher, the grain that falls where the mango leaned was meant to feed both trees. Everyone pauses. It's a poetic way of saying, the granary was placed for sharing, not for division. The families nod. Settlement reached. Memory wins. You sit back stunned. This isn't history, it's mediation with rhythm. You begin to wonder what it would be like if memory worked like this in your world. If a dispute at work could be solved by someone calmly walking in and singing a 10-year-old HR memo in verse. If getting a discount on groceries meant reciting the store's founding myth with emotional flair. It's absurd and, yet, kind of beautiful. The apprentice leans over and tells you his father once bought a fishing net by reciting an epic about the seller's grandfather catching a catfish big enough to swallow a goat's head. True story, he adds. Mostly, the story was so well told, the seller gave the net for free, because memory, when it resonates, becomes a kind of honor tax. If someone can remember your glory well enough, you don't charge them, you thank them. That night, before bed, you ask if there are ever punishments for forgetting. The apprentice considers. Not punishment, he says, but shame. If you forget something important, the community won't scold you, they'll just stop telling you things. You feel the weight of that. To be excluded from memory is not just to be forgotten, it's to become irrelevant. Suddenly you understand the apprentice's intensity. Every name he learns, every phrase he rehearses is part of his membership card into a society where remembering isn't just respectful, it's survival. And when you think about it, it's not so different from the way your world works, only subtler. After all, how many friendships, careers, even families hinge on who remembers what, and when? Maybe you're more like a griot than you thought. Maybe memory has always been currency. We're not this honest about it. The night the drums went silent, the moon has climbed high above the village now, casting pale light over the baobab tree and the clay rooftops. You're curled near the outer ring of the fire circle, watching a group of children doze off their heads lolling gently to the side as if the flames themselves were singing lullabies. Everything tonight feels familiar, comforting, cyclical, until it doesn't. Because suddenly there's a moment of hush, and then a realization that causes a subtle shift in the air. The drums are silent, not just quiet, absent. The rhythm, that usually pulses faintly in the background like a second heartbeat, is gone, and the villagers notice. Even the goats seem unusually alert, ears twitching. You glance at the apprentice, whose eyes have gone wide. They've stopped, he whispers, all of them, and you're about to learn something that rarely gets spoken about outside this place, what it means when the griot drums go quiet. First, your mainstream historical fact. Across West Africa, griots were often accompanied by musicians, especially drummers who used a variety of instruments like the djemtama, talking drum, and cybar to punctuate, emphasize, and even converse with the speaker. These instruments were not background noise, they were integral to the performance. often weaving coded commentary into the storytelling. A well-timed beat could signal sarcasm, approval, or an emotional shift in the tale, like a live soundtrack that spoke its own language. In some traditions, drumming was so important that it was taught before speech, with children learning rhythms for greetings, births, and even insults. But now, your delightfully peculiar fringe fact: the drums could also be used as protest. If a griot believed that a person had acted without honor by lying, cheating, or attempting to censor history, he could refuse to drum. The silence would be deafening, public, shameful in rare cases. An entire circle of griots would go silent for a night, sitting with their instruments but never touching them. This was considered one of the highest forms of public rebuke. Number scolding, no argument, just the absence of sound history refusing to be remembered. Tonight, that's what's happening. A respected merchant had promised to donate a parcel of land for the new storytelling circle, then backed out, quietly, selling the land to a trader from across the river. Technically legal, culturally disgraceful. And so, the drums are silent. The griots won't sing his family's deeds until he makes it right. You sit with this for a moment, stunned. You're used to protest involving noise chants, marches, slogans, but here, the withdrawal of story is the protest. It's haunting. It works. You ask the elder griot how long the silence will last. He shrugs. Depends on how long memory wants to wait. Then he adds more gently, it's not anger, it's mourning. And suddenly you understand the silence isn't just punishment. It's grief. For a history that was meant to be honored, not sold. For a tradition that depends on mutual respect, not mere legality. Which brings us to tonight's open scholarly debate. When griots practiced these silences, were they protecting truth, or wielding soft censorship of their own? Some academics argue that by refusing to tell certain stories or omitting certain names, griots could manipulate social narratives, creating unofficial erasures that favored certain lineages or perspectives. Others counter that silence was a tool of integrity used sparingly, as a way to preserve the dignity of the historical record, ensuring that it wasn't just a stage for whoever had the loudest purse. The truth is probably somewhere in between. But tonight, as you watch the community fall slowly into a hush that feels deeper than usual, you sense the weight of collective disapproval wrapped in velvet stillness. And then, just when you think the night might end in complete quiet, something unexpected happens. A child begins to hum, softly, nervously, a melody you heard during the wind songs 2 nights ago. It's a gentle, twining thing, almost a lullaby. One by one, others join, not the griots, not yet, but the people. A humming chorus builds, not loud but warm, not confrontational but firm. It's not a performance, it's a reminder. The griots may hold the stories, but the people hold the heartbeat. Eventually, the elder griot lifts his hand. No one speaks, but the humming stops instantly. Then he says, "Tomorrow we will remember again, if the river flows back to its source." A poetic way of saying he'll be watching. That night, the apprentice sits beside you and tells you of a time, years ago, when his older brother told a lie during a story circle and no one corrected him. The elder griot had simply refused to sing for 3 days. It was worse than getting whipped. The apprentice says, "He just disappeared." You nod. There's a kind of discipline in silence that no punishment can match, because it doesn't inflict, it withdraws. It tells you, you are not part of this right now. And in a culture where being remembered is the highest form of honor, being excluded from memory is worse than being scolded. Before bed, you try to recall the rhythm the child hummed, replaying it in your mind. It sticks. You find yourself wondering if the griots have noticed that you're remembering, too, that in some quiet way, you've become a tiny thread in this vast, musical tapestry. As your eyes close, the silence of the drums no longer feels empty. It feels expectant. And you, for once, are listening harder than ever. The apprentice's trial testing the living archive. It's dawn, but not the sleepy kind. The air feels like it's holding its breath, and you're gently shaken awake by the apprentice who has, for once, managed not to trip over his own feet. His voice is trembling with excitement. "Today's the trial," he whispers. You sit up groggily, rubbing your eyes. Trial. You're not sure if that means a legal proceeding or a running race. "It's my first test," he says, voice high with nerves. "I have to perform a chain link." You blink at him. "A what now?" He grins nervously. "You'll see." You follow him to the gathering space just as the early morning light spills, golden across the packed earth. People are already seated in a wide circle, elders in embroidered robes, children in sleepy piles, and at least 2 goats that no one seems particularly concerned about. In the center stands a single stool and nothing else. Then you remember something you heard several nights ago, when the elder Griot had mentioned that apprentices must, at a certain point, perform the chain of memory. What you're about to witness is not a simple oral quiz. It's a rite of passage, a public high-pressure test in which the apprentice must link at least 15 individuals, events, or objects together, not only by name and date, but by weaving them into a single continuous narrative. This isn't just about memorizing data. It's about proving that the apprentice can carry history as a living, breathing thing, not a list, but a story. So here's your mainstream historical fact. In Griot traditions, apprentices trained for years, sometimes decades, before being permitted to perform unsupervised. Their final tests weren't private ceremonies but public demonstrations, meant to prove not only knowledge but narrative control, the ability to connect seemingly unrelated elements: an ancestral birth, a famous hunt, a local flood, a colonial encounter into a seamless thread was seen as the ultimate sign of mastery. Memory wasn't enough. You had to make it sing. Now for your offbeat fringe fact. Sometimes the community would secretly swap out part of the planned performance, changing one of the expected links at the last second to see if the apprentice could improvise on the fly. The elder Griot might shout, "Replace the drummer's wedding with the goat sacrifice," or make the birth of Bakri's daughter the final anchor. This wasn't cruelty. It was a stress test to ensure the apprentice could adapt, rethread the story, and still make it feel smooth and intentional. The real skill wasn't perfect memory, it was perfect recovery. And now for your open scholarly debate. Some historians argue that these public trials, while impressive, may have created pressure to embellish or fictionalize certain parts of the oral record, especially when improvisation was involved. Others countered that the performance aspect was the point. It was never meant to be a rigid transcription of reality, but a living poetic truth meant to capture the emotional resonance of events, not just the who, what, when. Is Griot storytelling more art than history? Or is it just a different, equally valid form of archival memory? As the apprentice steps onto the stool, his knees visibly shaking, the elder Griot calls out the starting point. You begin with the founding of the Western village and end with the broken drum at Sally's wedding. The crowd murmurs. That's a hard pairing. The events are 60 years apart and have almost no obvious connection, but the apprentice closes his eyes, breathes, and begins. In the year when the river changed course and the sky held back its rain, a woman named just built the first granary with her own hands. And he's off. The crowd leans forward. You listen as he links the founding of a settlement to the birth of a merchant dynasty, to a disastrous trade caravan ambushed by hornets, yes, hornets, to the arrival of a new drummer from the coast, to the day he dropped his drum mid-song at a wedding, breaking the rhythm, and signaling the end of the old musical lineage. It's seamless, it's absurd, it's beautiful. You start to understand why this matters. He's not just showing off facts, he's showing that the history lives inside him, that he can carry it and weave it and shape it without dropping a single thread. But then right when you think he's done, the elder Griot interrupts. "No," he shouts. "Replace the wedding. End with the mango harvest after the locusts." The crowd gasps. That's brutal. The entire final structure must now shift. You see the apprentice flinch. His breath catches for 3 long seconds. The silence is heavy. But then he blinks, nods slightly, and keeps going. And though the drum was broken, it was the locusts who taught us to listen for rhythm in the absence of sound. Just as the mango tree bore fruit again after silence, the crowd exhales. It works, it fits. Somehow, miraculously, he made the pivot feel like it was meant to be there all along. The Griots exchange impressed glances. One elder grins. "You're pretty sure?" Someone wipes away a tear. The apprentice steps down. He doesn't smile, not yet. He waits. The elder Griot walks slowly to him, touches his shoulder, and says simply, "You are beginning to carry the breath." No clapping, no shouting, just that phrase, and it means everything. Later you ask what it means to carry the breath. The apprentice shrugs shyly. "It's the way we say you've started keeping the spirit of memory, not just the facts, the feeling, the soul." As night falls again, and you lie awake under a sky full of slow blinking stars, you realize something. In this village, stories are not told to impress, they're told to remember who they are. And the apprentice? He's not just remembering names, he's becoming the vessel that will carry them into tomorrow. Singing the bones of the land tonight, there's a strange reverence in the air, like the entire village is tiptoeing through memory. You wake to the sound of soft singing, not lullabies, not the usual Griot ballads, but something lower, slower, almost like humming carved from stone. The apprentice meets you with that familiar wide-eyed look that says, You're about to witness something ancient, so don't mess it up by asking questions too early. He leads you out past the storytelling circle, past the grain sheds, past even the goats that seem to sleep in shifts. You finally arrive at a clearing with no fire, no drums, no stool, just earth bare, cracked, and sitting on it, a group of griots with their palms pressed flat to the ground. What you're about to witness, the apprentice whispers, is called Singing the Bones, and it is one of the oldest, most sacred forms of Griot memory, a ritual in which the storytellers literally sing to the earth, using location-based memory to recount histories tied not to people, but to the land itself. And not just grand events. No, we're talking whispers of forgotten fields, disputed borders, ancient migration paths, even stories about a boulder that refuses to grow moss because someone cursed it with an insult 300 years ago. Here's your mainstream historical fact. In many West African cultures, griots were not confined to the memory of human affairs. They were also entrusted with geographic memory, especially in regions where oral mapping replaced cartographic records, rivers that changed courses, tree groves with sacred status, hills that served as old lookout points or were remembered and sung about so future generations could navigate both physically and spiritually. This land-based oral tradition helped track seasonal changes, sacred sites, and even natural resources. But the beauty of it was that these geographic records were encoded in song, which meant a griot could walk across an entire kingdom and through melody alone remember the contours of history. And now for your quirky fringe fact. In certain regions, griots would bury charms or small totems at key locations, hidden from view, to anchor specific memories. For example, a carved stone might be buried where a famous rain ceremony once worked after a drought, or a shell bracelet might be placed where a king once fled battle barefoot. These objects weren't marked above ground, but griots would remember them, return to them, and use them as mnemonic anchors. It's like a real-world version of a memory palace, except the palace is an actual field, and the corridors are carved into the dirt. The griots sitting here tonight know every one of those buried pieces, and their songs are like ritual GPS signals, recalibrating the collective memory with every chant. As they sing, you notice their hands move not dramatically, just slight finger taps or full palm presses, as if waking up the ground beneath them. You don't understand the words, but the rhythm is unmistakably deliberate. The apprentice whispers. Translations. That hill swallowed fire once. A leopard used to bathe here. The grain remembers the child who fell. It's mesmerizing, and it leads us into tonight's scholarly debate. Can geographic oral memory be as reliable as written cartography? Some researchers argue that Griot's memory of the land preserved far more than colonial maps ever did, especially when it came to seasonal movements, clan boundaries, and environmental shifts. Others argue that the fluidity of song allows for too much subjective reinterpretation over generations. But one thing is clear. When colonial officials arrived in certain West African regions, the maps they brought didn't always match the lived knowledge of the people who walked the land daily and sang to it nightly. And in more than one case, officials found themselves relying on griots to locate wells, trails, and forgotten settlements. Griots weren't just entertainers. They were walking at lasses. You sit in the dirt beside the apprentice now, quietly, absorbing the rhythms, the rising and falling phrases. It's not a performance, it's more like a communion with time. One griot stands, moves 6 paces left, then begins to chant a phrase that makes several villagers murmur in recognition. The apprentice tells you that's the spot where an ancestor once drew a line in the sand during a clan dispute. Apparently, the griots still remember the exact place he did it, 300 years later. There's no plaque, just memory. The earth holds it, and they're singing it back into life. Later that evening, you walk back through the quiet village, now somehow feeling denser with meaning. Every rock, every tree stump, every empty patch of grass, it could be a monument. You ask the apprentice if these songs ever change. He nods. Yes, he says, but only when the land changes first. That sticks with you because, in a world where history is often rewritten by whoever has the loudest pen, hear it only, which shifts when the very earth demands it. As you settle into your mat tonight, sleep comes slowly, not because you're restless, but because you're newly attuned to every tiny sound, the crunch of dry grass, the call of a distant bird, the creak of the baobab bark. It feels like the world is whispering old things to you, things it's been trying to say for a long time. And maybe, just maybe, you're finally ready to remember where you are, not just where you've been. The day the story went missing morning begins with an unusual energy. Not quite panic, but close. You notice it first in the faces of the elders, normally so unshakably calm, who are glancing at each other with furrowed brows. The apprentice is pacing in small, fast circles, muttering to himself and tugging at the edge of his robe. It's not the usual dramatic fretting you've grown used to. This time it's real. Something is wrong. Then you hear it. The story is missing. That's it. Just that. Not stolen, not forgotten, missing like it wandered off during the night. You sit up straighter. What story? You ask, expecting some elaborate myth or a legend about a mountain-sized turtle who once ate the moon. But the answer surprises you. It's the story of the Millet Treaty, an important peace agreement between two villages nearly a century ago, brokered over shared grain stores during a brutal drought. It's one of the foundation stones of the local oral record. Every apprentice is supposed to memorize it by year 2, and today no one can remember it. Not the elder Griot, not the backup Griot, not even the villager who claims his great-grandmother cooked the millet for the ceremony. Everyone remembers that the story exists, but the details are gone. The order, the names, the lines. It's like someone came in during the night and wiped it away from their minds. Which brings us to tonight's mainstream historical fact. Even though Griots were famed for their incredible memory, they were also deeply aware of the fragility of oral tradition. That's why many West African communities developed redundancy systems, assigning multiple griots to preserve the same tale, training multiple apprentices in parallel, and reciting stories aloud at regular intervals. The idea was simple. You don't rely on one person to carry a kingdom's memory. You create a network. And yet, even with all this redundancy, sometimes stories still disappeared. Enter our fringe fact. In some traditions, it was believed that a story could leave of its own accord, walk away, as the saying went, if a tale was neglected, disrespected, or altered too much for convenience. Griots believed it would simply refuse to be told until it was properly honored. There are recorded moments when entire communities would hold story-finding rituals, not ceremonies of singing, fasting, and storytelling in hopes of coaxing a forgotten tale to return. Some believed that stories were like spirits or ancestors. They could be insulted, and they could go silent, and when they did, people felt it. Which brings us to the scholarly debate. How do we grapple with lost oral histories in academic circles? Some scholars argue that the absence of verifiable detail renders certain Griot accounts unreliable. Others argue that the very recognition of a gap in the record is evidence of a rich tradition that understands its own limitations. In other words, knowing a story is missing and searching for it is more historically responsible than pretending it was never there. So now, the village is mobilizing for a kind of intellectual search party. The Griots are sitting in tight circles, humming old rhythms, trying to jog each other's memories. The apprentice has pulled out a worn piece of cloth covered in hand-drawn memory symbols, dots, lines, stick figures with exaggerated eyes. He's hoping one of them might trigger a detail. You offer to help, and the apprentice blinks at you. Do you remember anything? He asks, clearly not expecting much. You shake your head. But then you pause. Something strange stirs in your mind, a phrase you don't know where it came from. You whisper. The millet was ground with mourning, and mixed with hope. The apprentice freezes. What did you say? You repeat it slowly. He sprints away, returns with the elder Griot, who stares at you with such intensity you're suddenly aware of every awkward thing you've ever said in your life. Say it again, he demands. You do. The elder Griot nods. That was the opening line, he says quietly. We're beginning to remember. And just like that, the story begins to return. Not all at once, not perfectly, but in fragments, like rain tapping softly at a window you forgot was open. The names emerge first, then the gifts. Then the moment when one chief offered his only remaining seed sack, not to the richer village, but to the poorer one, saying, "Let your hunger end before mine." You're stunned to watch it unfold. It's like seeing an old friend walk back into a room. Everyone exhales. The circle is saved. That night, the apprentice sits with you beside the fire. You brought the story back, he says. You shake your head. I'd just remembered a line, but he looks at you like you've done something remarkable. That's how it always starts, he says. Just one line. And then the story decides it can trust you again. You fall asleep under a sky that feels just a little more full, a little more vibrant, as if the universe is pleased that something lost has returned. And maybe, just maybe, you start to believe that stories really do have souls and that they choose their listeners just as much as listeners choose them. The Griot who refused to speak tonight. The sky is unusually quiet, no drums in the distance, no fire crackling stories echoing across the village. Even the crickets seem to be holding their breath. You wandered toward the circle out of habit, expecting the usual thrum of soft laughter and rhythmic storytelling. but instead find the apprentices sitting silently, legs crossed, faces turned toward the center. In the middle sits an elder Griot you've never seen before. His robe is deep indigo, almost blending into the twilight. His eyes are closed, his hands still. He's not speaking, not even moving. He's the Griot who doesn't speak. The apprentice whispers. You raise an eyebrow. That's not ideal, you think. Isn't speaking sort of the whole job? But the apprentice shakes his head. He only tells stories with gestures. His whole body is the story. Now that's new. As you sit down quietly, you begin to realize you're about to witness something more powerful than any chant or Beluda performance made entirely of movement, expression, and memory without words. This brings us to your mainstream historical fact. While Griots are most famous for their verbal storytelling, non-verbal traditions also played an important role in some West African cultures. Certain Griots, particularly in regions where multiple languages intersected, used gesture-based storytelling, dance, and even symbolic body positions to convey historical narratives to mixed audiences. It wasn't just performance, it was communication across linguistic borders. You see, in ancient crossroads towns like Jen or Timbuktu, traders, travelers, and locals spoke many dialects, so griots developed a physical grammar, rich in gestures, facial expressions, and rhythmic movements that could speak across tongues. And now, your fringe fact. In some traditions, a griot who refused to speak wasn't being defiant, he was enacting an ancient mourning ritual. When a major lineage ended, such as when a royal bloodline died without an heir, the griot would remain silent for 7 cycles of the moon, performing only through motion to symbolize the gap in the kingdom's continuity. Silence was not absence, it was a form of public grief. Tonight's griot begins his story not with a word but with a slow raising of one hand, fingers bent like roots stretching from the soil, then a step back, to forward, a bowed head. The apprentices watch intently, mirroring the gestures. It's clearly a story they know, even if you don't. You lean in, trying to read it like a language. The griot stops suddenly, eyes wide, hands clutching at the air. Then a slow turn, as if seeking something lost. The apprentice leans over and whispers, "This part's about the day the stars failed to rise." You blink. What? It's symbolic, he clarifies. There was a year when the night sky seemed empty during a long drought. People thought the sky was mourning too. You nod slowly, not sure if it's myth or metaphor, but either way, it's mesmerizing. Which brings us to an open scholarly debate. Some researchers argue that gesture-based storytelling was merely theatrical flourish, an add-on to oral tradition. But others suggest it was central, a way to encode emotion, pacing, and symbolic meaning beyond language. Just as modern sign languages have grammar and syntax, griot gestures may have followed their own internal logic. In fact, some scholars are now attempting to catalog recurring gesture symbol pairings from oral accounts to study how information was passed visually across generations. And suddenly you realize this griot is not silent. His body is speaking volumes. He crouches, low palm flat to the earth, and then rises slowly with both arms sweeping upward. The apprentice murmurs, "That's the flood that ended the dry years and the twist." The griot ends not with a dramatic flourish, but with stillness. Arms at his side, eyes closed, chest rising and falling slowly. It's like the story exhaled and returned to the air. No applause, no commentary, just silence, the kind that honors rather than fills. Afterward, you walk back slowly, asking the apprentice what it means when a griot doesn't speak. He thinks for a long time, then says softly, "Sometimes a story is too big for words," and you believe him. Because tonight, you felt history in the weight of a bowed head. You heard the echo of kingdoms in the sweep of a hand, and you learned that not every story needs a voice, some just need a witness. As you curl into your mat beneath the quiet sky, the memory of those movements plays again behind your eyelids. A raised hand, a dropped head, a turning in place. They loop softly, rhythmically, like a lullaby without sound, and you understand, now that silence can be sacred at some times. The stillest moments are the ones that carry the heaviest truths. Memory through the drumbeat. The night air is thick with heat, but the village doesn't seem to care. Tonight, something special is happening. You can already feel it in the cadence of footsteps and the soft rustling of robes. A low rhythm pulses. In the background, thump, thump, thump. It's not the usual griot storytelling session. There's no firelit circle or humorous introduction. Instead, you're drawn toward a series of carefully arranged drums, each carved from hollowed wood and stretched hide, gleaming in the moonlight like waiting sentinels. Around them sit drummers, young, old, men, and women, each cradling a different size instrument, waiting for a cue. You glance at the apprentice, who is unusually serious. This, he says, is how the Griots remember with rhythm. Tonight we listen with our skin, not our ears. He taps his chest twice. It's a night for the drum stories. This brings us to a mainstream historical fact. In many West African cultures, drums were far more than musical instruments. They were speech tools. Specifically, talking drums, such as the dunduing or a tumpan, could replicate the tone and pitch patterns of regional languages. Skilled drummers could send detailed messages across long distances or accompany a griot's tale with rhythm sequences that mimicked spoken phrases. In some areas, entire histories were encoded not in lyrics, but in beats. A drum beat could signify births, deaths, royal decrees, or even the rise of a new trading season. And what's most remarkable, the message was audible but not understood by everyone. Only those trained to interpret its musical language could hear the full meaning. In short, some griots didn't just speak history, they drummed it. Now, the fringe fact. There were griots so fluent in drum language that they could recite multi-generational lineages without uttering a word, using only rhythm. Some apprentices spent years learning to distinguish subtle shifts in tempo, pressure, and tone to identify references. And get this, some griots insisted that the drum itself had memory. A well-worn drum, they said, would remember its most repeated rhythms, resonating them more deeply and clearly than new ones. There are even stories of a drum that refused to sound properly until a particular family's tale was told in full, a sort of percussionist's superstition, but held with deep seriousness. So tonight, as the elder griot approaches the center drum, the villagers fall silent. He taps it once flat, palmed hard, then again, softer, and then begins a slow rhythm that makes the air seem to ripple. The apprentice whispers to you, "This is the story of the twins who argued across kingdoms." You sit still, spine straight, letting the beat move through you. And sure enough, it builds like an argument, one drum starting low, the other interrupting sharply, then both tumbling into a chaotic flurry. It's astonishing. You don't understand the words, but you feel the emotion, frustration, defiance. Then a sudden silence. The apprentice nods. That was the part where one twin left for the coast. You realize, this is more than music. It's embodied language. A griot with no voice, no scribe, no parchment, just hands, tension, and rhythm can preserve the entire bloodline's tale. And every time that story is played, the rhythm is passed on like a spoken sentence. Now for the scholarly debate. Can musical memory be counted as historical record? Some historians argue that without written or spoken language, drum communication is too fluid, subject to embellishment, mood, even performer style. But others insist that drum history is no less structured than oral narrative. The rhythms are memorized, drilled, even codified into systems of symbolic association. And when a griot teaches an apprentice, it's not just about copying sound, it's about inheriting meaning, much like a musical score, but one passed hand to hand, ear to ear. Interestingly, modern ethnomusicologists have even begun mapping griot drum sequences against historical events and finding remarkable consistency over time. Back in the village, the rhythm has changed again. Now it's gentle, lilting, even funny. Children giggle quietly. It's apparently a well-known drum joke involving a stubborn goat and a rainmaker who accidentally flooded his own house. The apprentice translates with small gestures, tapping his own chest and thighs to illustrate the beat. The story ends with a rapid-fire burst of slaps on the drumhead, like the sound of 1,000 tiny feet running away. Laughter rises. Even the elders chuckle. The drums rest out later that evening. As people file away, you walk past the instruments. They're still silent, but somehow still alive, like their skins are breathing memory. The apprentice touches one drum gently, fingers lingering on the worn edge. "This one tells my grandfather's birth story," he says. "It only sounds right when I play it the same way he did." You nod, understanding for the first time that these aren't just tools, they're family. And every time they're played, they're singing the past back into shape. You'll lie awake a while longer tonight, listening to the fading rhythm that still echoes in your chest. You wonder how many stories you've walked past in your life because they didn't come wrapped in words. Maybe history isn't always something you hear. Maybe sometimes you feel it in the beat, in the silence between, in the body that remembers even when the tongue is still. The day you were the griot, it's dawn again, and for once, the sky seems in no hurry. The horizon smears itself in quiet golds and sleepy blues while the village yawns itself awake. Smoke curls lazily from morning fires, and the usual chorus of roosters sings out like they're competing to be chief. But there's a different kind of excitement in the air today. It starts when you realize no one is gathering around the elder Griots' hut. Instead, the crowd is forming in the middle of the village square around you. You catch the apprentice's eye, who simply nods and gestures to a spot near the circle of drums, mats and calabash cups arranged like some ancient invitation. "It's your turn," he says. Your stomach flips in surprise. "Me," but your voice sounds small against the backdrop of sunrise. "I don't know the stories like you do." He shrugs with an annoyingly calm smile. "You've been here for 25 nights. You know more than you think." And so begins the final tale, not with a master Griot's booming voice or a clever proverb, but with your hesitant footsteps toward the center of the square. You sit cross-legged, you breathe, you try to remember, and surprisingly you do. Not all of it, not perfectly, but enough. You begin with something simple, the story of the cloth dyer who accidentally created the villager's sacred color when he left a pot of dye boiling for 3 days while chasing a runaway goat. It gets a few smiles. Then you move on to the one about the Griot who had to sing the praises of a king with such an unpronounceable name that he invented his own rhythm just to get through it. A child giggles. A woman claps once. Encouragement. You start to build a rhythm of your own, not with drums or chants, but with confidence. And as you speak, something strange happens. You begin to feel the weight of memories settle on your shoulders. Not heavy, but grounding. Like the robes of a Griot passed down. This is the story you were always meant to tell. The one about your own journey into this strange, mesmerizing world of spoken history, living memory, and quiet awe. Here's your final mainstream historical fact. In many West African communities, Griots didn't inherit their roles strictly by blood. They were chosen, sometimes by birth, yes, but also sometimes by the community, by apprenticeship, or by the sheer force of memory. If someone demonstrated the heart and discipline to carry the stories, they were entrusted with the role of an if they were outsiders. Oral tradition was a living entity, and anyone who proved worthy could be invited to join the lineage of tellers. Your fringe fact. There's an old man belief that each story chooses its teller. It travels like wind, seeking someone whose voice and heart align. If the story settles near you, you feel compelled to speak, even if you don't know why. Elders say this is how Griots are truly chosen, not by training, but by being claimed by the tale itself. And the open scholarly debate. Historians today are rethinking how we classify memory. Is it passive storage, like a hard drive, or is it a collaborative, cultural ritual and ongoing performance of remembering? Increasingly, scholars argue for the latter. Memory, they say, is not just content, it's relationship. And Griots understood this better than anyone. As your story winds to its close, the sun crests over the treetops. You look around. The villagers are listening, not politely, but genuinely. Even the elder Griot is nodding slowly, his eyes closed as if tasting the rhythm in your words. You end with a line the apprentice taught you. When the stars forget their names, we remind them. Silence, then applause, not raucous, but warm, enveloping. The kind of applause that says, you did well, you remembered, you carried the voice of history for one night, and you did not drop it. Later, as the crowd disperses, the elder Griot approaches and places something in your hand. A single carved bead, blackened, smooth with age. "From my teacher," he says, "now yours." You tuck it into your robe, unsure what it means, but sensing it's something sacred. That night, you lie beneath the sky that now feels familiar, like a ceiling you've grown to trust. You close your eyes, and just before sleep takes you, you whisper a single phrase to the stars. Unsure where you learned it, but sure it matters. Tell the story. Even when the words are shy,